Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still remember that day in November 2019 like it was yesterday. It was my first assignment with the Protectores Ancestrales, and I couldn't shake the mix of excitement and dread I felt walking into Millinocket that cold morning. The trees were mostly barren, the wind kept stirring up the dead leaves along the trail, and the entire place had this strange stillness that made me feel like I was trespassing. Even Willow McGregor, one of the most unflappable people I've ever met, seemed a bit on edge, though she tried covering it up with her usual jokes. She has these intricate Aztec tattoos on her arms, and I caught her running her fingertips over them, like maybe it grounded her somehow. We were there because of reports that something out of the ordinary was roaming the woods. Some people called it a shapeshifter. Others claimed they had no clue what it was, only that it was dangerous. There'd been talk of missing pets, livestock found half-eaten, and weird footprints that local hunters said definitely weren't from bears or wolves. Even before I got out of the truck, I felt the temperature drop in a way that didn't feel natural. I mean, Maine in November is no joke, but this was different, like the air itself got heavier. Willow and I grabbed our gear. We had these thermal scanners that could detect odd energy signatures, along with a small kit of protective items from different native traditions, things like herbs, feathers, small carved talismans. I remember fumbling with my gloves, trying to keep my fingers warm enough to press the buttons on the scanner. It was around mid-morning when we started walking the main trail leading into deeper woods. The plan was simple. Gather initial data, observe, and call for backup only if we felt the situation was too risky. Right from the start, I noticed how quiet the forest was. Normally, you'd hear birds, or maybe the distant rustle of squirrels, but all we heard was our own breathing and the crunch of leaves under our boots. Every so often, a gust of wind would blow, sending a shiver down my spine. I swear, it felt like something was watching us, and not in a curious, friendly way. About an hour in, Willow stopped short and held up her hand, signaling me to go still. I followed her gaze and spotted a shadow moving behind a cluster of pines off to our left. It was quick, like it darted from tree to tree in a blink. My first instinct was to call out, but Willow shot me a look that screamed, "Don't do anything stupid." I nodded, heart pounding. We both started moving quietly in that direction, trying to see more. We got closer, and this figure came into view for just a second. It was tall but hunched over, and its outline kept flickering between something vaguely human and something else. Its limbs seemed too long, the head slightly elongated, like it was halfway between a person and an animal. Then it was gone again, slipping behind the trees so fast I almost doubted what I'd just seen. But Willow's expression told me she saw it too. My mind was racing with every worst-case scenario. I'd heard stories about creatures that could mimic voices or shapes that liked to lure people off trails. But this was different. Whatever it was, it had a certain intelligence in how it moved. It was definitely observing us as much as we were observing it. And it gave off this awful feeling, like the air crackled wherever it passed. My instincts were practically screaming that we were in over our heads. Willow whispered that we should keep our distance and gather as much info as we could. I pulled out the scanner, trying to keep my hand steady enough to take readings. At first, nothing registered, which was weird. Then the device spiked so high it nearly beeped off the charts. My stomach did a flip. When the reading disappeared just as fast, Willow took that as our cue to back off. She knew from experience that confronting something unknown without backup was a huge gamble. We retreated to a small clearing near the trailhead where we could radio the rest of the team. The wind had picked up, and I remember thinking it felt almost electric, like a storm was about to roll in. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that thing was going to jump out at any second. My gut wouldn't settle down, and Willow was checking our surroundings every few seconds. It took a bit of fiddling with the radio, typical static issues, but eventually we reached the others. They were a few miles away, so we agreed to meet at a point halfway between us. We started walking back, and that's when the forest went from unsettling to downright terrifying. We heard this piercing cry echo through the trees. It didn't sound like any animal I recognized. It was shrill and guttural at the same time, like several creatures screaming together. Willow's face went pale. I nearly dropped my flashlight. The cry came again, this time from a different direction, closer. The scanner began flickering wildly in my hand, the temperature sensor plummeting to near-freezing levels, even though we'd just been in a spot that felt slightly warmer. I couldn't see the creature, but I felt it. There was this presence circling around us, invisible, but somehow right on top of us. Willow scanned the tree line with a flashlight, and for a split second, that shape appeared again, except now it looked more animal than human, its eyes reflecting a ghostly light, the body hunched like it was ready to pounce. I froze, too scared to even point, but it just stood there, half hidden behind a tree trunk, blinking at us like it was deciding what to do next. Then, all at once, it vanished into the darkness without a sound. My chest felt like it was about to explode from how hard my heart was hammering. Willow grabbed my arm and we took off, not running exactly, but moving as fast as we could while still trying to maintain some composure. Leaves crunched loudly with each step, and every little noise made me jump. I felt like the forest had turned into some kind of maze we couldn't escape. After what felt like forever, we finally saw the headlights of our teammates' vehicles through the thinning trees. 4 of them rushed out to meet us with gear in hand, scanning the perimeter with floodlights and thermal cameras. But by then, everything was silent again, like the forest had swallowed all traces of that thing. We fumbled through an explanation, pointing in the direction we'd last seen it, describing its movements and the weird fluctuations in temperature. The others spread out, calling out to each other, combing the area for footprints, fur, anything. They found a few strange marks in the leaf-strewn ground, but nothing conclusive. And just like that, it was over. The fear and tension lingered, but the creature, or whatever it was, had completely vanished. No more howls, no more shadows flitting between the trees. It was almost as if the forest was returning to normal. The temperature seemed to rise back to regular November chill. The equipment stopped glitching, and even the wind died down to a gentle breeze. It was unsettling how abrupt it was, like the whole thing had never happened. We spent a few more hours trying to gather more evidence, but we came up empty. Eventually, we packed up and headed back into town. The sky was already dark by then, and no one said much on the drive back. My nerves were shot, and Willow looked equally rattled, her hand still absently tracing the tattoos on her forearm. I kept replaying the creature's silhouette in my mind, the way it changed shape in the blink of an eye. And those eyes, I still get chills thinking about them. That night ended without any neat explanation. None of us could truly piece together what we saw or what it meant. It's been years, and I still can't explain what happened in those woods. Whatever was out there didn't leave behind any clear proof, just a gut-wrenching sense that there are things in this world that defy our understanding. Sometimes I wonder if it was watching us the whole time, choosing to show itself for reasons we'll never know. All I can say is, that day in Millinocket changed how I look at the world. 1 minute everything is normal, and the next, reality flips upside down. And just as fast as it arrived, it vanished, leaving behind more questions than answers. I still don't sleep easy when I think about it. Story 2. I still get chills every time I remember that day back in 1997. Bisbee, Arizona, had never seemed so eerie to me before. I was Mason Deerfoot, part of the Sombras Rubras team, with Michael Two Bears and Emily Featherwind. We were basically the town's go-to group whenever some bizarre report popped up. Strange sightings, odd animal kills, or rumors of creatures that didn't fit any normal explanation. That particular day started pretty much like any other. Scorching sun, dusty roads, and that desert wind whispering through the canyons. Michael and Emily had already been out in the field earlier, checking on new footprints they'd found near an old ranch. They radioed me around mid-morning, sounding a little spooked but trying to keep cool. They said the footprints were bigger than anything they'd seen before, and they smelled something foul in the air, like rotten eggs mixed with wet fur. Even after all the weird stuff we'd investigated in the past, that description made my stomach turn. I stayed at our makeshift base in an old trailer on the outskirts of Bisbee, going through old records of previous sightings in the region. Most were random notes about unidentifiable shapes in the night, or livestock found in pieces without a clear predator. Nothing super concrete, but there was a pattern. These stories always mentioned a stench and prints that looked off, like they belonged to something that didn't quite exist in any wildlife manual. I felt uneasy, like we were sitting on the edge of something none of us truly understood. By mid-afternoon, Michael and Emily came back to regroup. Emily's face was pale, and Michael was oddly quiet. They placed a plaster cast of the footprints on a table. It was huge, wider than a mountain lion's paw, and shaped in a way that didn't match any known animal. I tried to keep calm, reminding myself that illusions can happen in the desert, but that cast was physical proof. Something was roaming around out there, and we were the ones expected to handle it. We decided to check out the perimeter near the ranch before sunset. The terrain out there is mostly rugged rock and mesquite trees, so we had to park and walk the rest of the way. Right away, I noticed an unnatural silence. Usually, you'd hear some birds, or at least the wind rustling bushes, but it felt like everything had gone dead still. Every step I took on the gravel sounded louder than it should have. Then I caught the smell. It was the same foul odor Michael had mentioned earlier, and it was stronger than anything I'd ever experienced. It clung to the back of my throat, and my eyes started watering. Emily was covering her nose, looking around with obvious discomfort. Michael just kept scanning the rocks and bushes with his rifle at the ready. We didn't plan on shooting anything. We just wanted to be prepared in case this creature wasn't exactly friendly. We reached the spot where they'd found the footprints earlier. The sun was going down, painting the desert in long shadows. I remember feeling like we were being watched, even though I couldn't see anything. My heart started pounding for no apparent reason, and I couldn't shake off the sensation that something was lurking behind every boulder. Michael motioned for us to keep our voices low, so we just signaled each other, moving slowly through the area. That's when Emily pointed to a large rock formation up ahead. There was a fresh set of prints in the sandy patch right at the base. I crouched down to examine them, and they were definitely similar to the cast we had, massive, with elongated toes and marks that didn't align with a normal paw. But this time, the prints were deeper, almost like whatever made them had gained weight or pressed down harder. We followed them a little further, and the smell got so overpowering I nearly gagged. Suddenly, Michael stopped short, raising his hand for us to freeze. I strained my eyes and thought I saw movement in the shadows about 20 yards ahead. It was just a glimpse, a hint of something large, hunched over, with a posture that didn't look natural. My pulse went through the roof. Emily whispered that it moved too fast to be a person, but we didn't dare call out or do anything that might provoke it. We stayed there, crouched among the rocks, for what felt like an eternity. The wind started picking up, making the bushes rustle, and every little sound made my nerves spike. I couldn't see that silhouette anymore, but I felt this heavy presence, like we were intruding on something's territory. Emily was gripping her flashlight so hard her knuckles were white. I remember looking at Michael, and he just nodded silently, like he understood we needed to keep going, but also remain cautious. We inched forward, following the track around a bend. I was sweating despite the cool desert evening breeze. My mind raced with questions. What if it was some unknown predator or, worse, something that fell into the legends we'd always treated with skepticism? The stories about creatures that roam the desert at night, feeding on unsuspecting animals, or maybe even people, suddenly felt a lot less like folklore. Then we heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl or a moan. It echoed against the rocks, and for a second I thought my knees would buckle. We were close, too close. Michael motioned for us to stay behind him. We carefully approached a narrow pass between two large boulders, and that's when I glimpsed a shape sprinting away, its movement jerky and almost unnatural. It was gone in a heartbeat, leaving only the lingering stench. Our instincts told us to follow, but we also knew we might be dealing with something that could outpace and outmaneuver us. Plus, the light was fading fast. I'm not proud to admit it, but I was torn between chasing after it and bolting back to the car. I felt like if I took one step forward, I'd be crossing some line of no return. Something about that shape made my skin crawl, like it was neither fully an animal nor fully human. Michael decided we should retreat and try to circle around, hoping we could corner it, or at least get a better look from another angle. We moved quickly, our flashlights flickering in the twilight, scanning every rock and bush. The odor faded as we moved away from the spot, giving me a small sense of relief. At least I could breathe normally again. But a deeper dread settled in. It knew we were here, and it wasn't giving us the upper hand. Night settled in, and everything became a disorienting maze of shadows. We kept hearing faint rustles, maybe just the wind, maybe not. I swear I felt eyes on us the entire time. Emily and I stuck close to Michael, relying on his instincts. He was calm, but I could see tension in his jaw. None of us said it out loud, but we were frightened by the idea that this thing might not be just another predator. Finally, we reached a ridge overlooking Bisbee. You could see the distant glow of a few house lights. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked from up there, totally unaware of what might be prowling in the darkness nearby. We took a moment to catch our breath and decide if we should stay out here all night or head back to update our higher-ups. The plan was to protect the town, but we couldn't protect anyone if we got ourselves torn apart by something we didn't understand. And then, out of nowhere, that awful smell came back, stronger than ever. We spun around, but we only saw shifting darkness. We heard this quick scrabbling sound on the rocks, like sharp claws scraping stone. I felt panic rise in my chest, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Even Michael looked startled. We pointed our flashlights everywhere, but it was gone, if it was ever there at all. The whole encounter lasted maybe a few seconds, but it felt like minutes. By that point, our nerves were shot. We decided to call it a night. We double-checked that no one in the town had been harmed, then drove back to our base. My hands were trembling when I finally set my gear down. Emily and Michael just kept exchanging these knowing glances, like we all realized we'd experienced something we couldn't fully explain. We were used to weird stuff, but this was different, like we were trespassing on something ancient that didn't belong in our logical world. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that hunched figure and heard that growl echoing against the canyon walls. The next morning, we scoured the area again with more light, but all we found were those same strange footprints and some scattered remains of an animal I couldn't quite identify. The stench was mostly gone, but the feeling of dread remained. To this day, I can't say what we encountered. We never got a clear look, never found a body or any definitive proof. But we knew something was out there, lurking in those desert shadows. After that night, Bisbee went quiet again, like everything just stopped. No more sightings, no more weird carcasses, nothing. It was almost as if whatever it was decided to move on, or maybe just went deeper underground, waiting for the right moment to come back. I still carry that memory with me, and I've never been able to shake off the sense that what we saw wasn't an ordinary creature. It felt more like something from the stories our grandparents used to tell, only this time we were seeing it with our own eyes. And no matter how much time has passed, I still don't have any answers. All I know is that for one terrifying day, we came face to face with a force that reminded me the desert holds secrets we may never understand. And sometimes those secrets stare right back at us from the darkness, then vanish without a trace, leaving us to wonder if any of it was real or just some twisted dream. Story 3. I still remember that day in the summer of 2009, like it happened yesterday. I was stationed in a remote fire lookout tower near Mariposa, right in the Sierra Nevada. My name is Everett, and I've always loved the quietness of those mountains, the feeling that you can hear your own heartbeat echo through the pines. But there was one afternoon, out of all those calm days, that changed everything for me. The heat was intense that day, and the air felt heavier than usual. My routine was simple: scan for any smoke or signs of fire, keep my notes in order, and check in with Doris over the radio every now and then. Doris worked at another tower not too far away, well, not too far in mountain terms anyway. After a while, you get used to the isolation. You start to enjoy the silence, or at least I did. But in the middle of that afternoon, I noticed odd movements below. I picked up my binoculars, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Something big was moving in the underbrush, weaving in and out of sight. It was too big to be a regular coyote or deer, and the way it moved, so slow at first, then darting behind thicker trees, made my stomach tighten. I couldn't see details, but my instincts told me it wasn't just some bear wandering around. I tried to shrug it off. Sometimes the mountains play tricks on you, but each time I glanced down, I caught glimpses of that same shape, too large and too clumsy to be normal. It vanished behind a cluster of pines, then reappeared further away. I radioed Doris out of curiosity, and maybe a bit of nerves. She snorted a laugh and teased that I was getting bored up there. It bugged me, but I tried to let it go. Toward late afternoon, I decided to step outside to gather some wood. The tower has a little storage area beneath it, and there's a patch of trees nearby where fallen branches are easy to collect. That's when I heard it, a sharp, high-pitched noise that sounded almost like laughter. It came from somewhere just beyond my line of sight in the thick brush. My brain stalled for a second, trying to make sense of that sound. It was too strange, too human-like, but warped somehow. I felt a chill despite the heat. Right away, I called Doris on the radio. She didn't joke this time. Her tone shifted, and she told me to be careful. By then, the sun was dropping toward the horizon, and the forest shadows were getting longer. I decided it was best to head back up the tower before it got too dark. Once night settled in, the forest seemed to come alive with unfamiliar noises. Usually I enjoy how the woods hum at night, but this was different. I felt like eyes were on me, studying me from somewhere in the pitch black. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my ears. Then I reached into my pocket for the radio and realized it was gone. It must have slipped out when I was grabbing that wood, and I had no idea where it fell. That meant I couldn't call Doris or anyone else for help. It's amazing how quickly fear can set in. Every little sound, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, felt magnified. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself the wind was shifting or small animals were moving around. But then I glanced out of the tower window and froze. Below me, illuminated faintly by the moonlight, was a huge shape pacing around the base of the structure. It seemed to slink back and forth, never staying in one spot for too long, almost like it was scoping the place out. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I realized how exposed I actually was up there. The only thing that gave me any sense of security was the flare gun we kept for emergencies. It wasn't exactly a weapon, but it was better than nothing. I gripped it so tight my knuckles went pale. At that point, the sounds got louder, a mix of scraping on metal and soft thuds against the tower supports. It felt like I was trapped, listening to something testing every angle, as if it was trying to figure out a way inside. I remember standing next to the tower's main door, hands shaking, waiting for some kind of crash or a claw busting through the wood. Every second felt like an hour. I kept thinking, is this how it ends? My breath came in shallow gulps, and the oppressive darkness outside made me imagine all sorts of shapes lurking just beyond my field of vision. Then, out of nowhere, I saw bright headlights cutting through the trees. The roar of an engine echoed up the slope, and I've never felt such relief in my life. Doris had come. As soon as the beams landed on the tower's base, that creature bolted. I caught just a partial glimpse, an enormous silhouette leaning away from the light, moving with a speed I didn't think was possible for something that size. It disappeared into the woods before Doris could fully see it. She pulled up in an old truck, shouting my name as she climbed out. The second she realized I was okay, she called in for more support. By the time the others arrived, some local ranger folks with non-lethal weapons and tranquilizers, there was no sign of the thing. They searched around the tower and deeper into the forest, but whatever had been there was long gone. All they found were a few broken branches, some unusual tracks in the soft dirt, and scattered marks on the tower's supports that looked like claw scratches. Nothing conclusive enough to prove what I'd seen. A formal investigation followed, but it didn't go anywhere. No official records of anything like it. No creature matching that description. No evidence beyond those weird footprints and some hair samples that didn't match local wildlife. Eventually, the search was called off. Everyone went on with their lives, and I was left with this lingering feeling that there are things in those mountains we simply don't understand. Even now, thinking about it makes my pulse quicken. I still visit Mariposa from time to time, and I can't shake the sense that something's out there, hidden behind the trees, beyond the footpaths people usually walk. It doesn't matter how many people say it was just a bear or some trick of the light. I know what I saw, and I can't explain it. The forest went back to being quiet, as if nothing ever happened. But I'll never look at that place the same way again. Story 4. I still get chills remembering that evening. It started like any regular shift at the park. My name's Jasper Zielinski, and I've always been fascinated by caves, which is how I ended up working as a guard near the Grand Canyon, in this tiny town called Hampton Caves. Normally, I'd clock out right before sunset, but that day I decided to stay a bit longer. I don't even remember what possessed me to do it. Maybe I just liked the quiet, or maybe I needed some extra time to finish up paperwork. Whatever the reason, it changed my life. Earlier that day, it was busy. A bunch of visitors came through, and we spent most of the morning guiding them around and making sure they stuck to the marked trails. By late afternoon, my colleague Ricky was pretty much done. He asked if I wanted to head out together, but I told him I'd close up on my own. He waved goodbye, hopped in his truck, and left. That was the last normal moment I remember. The sky was this gorgeous mix of orange and pink as the sun started dipping behind the canyon. I locked up the main office and stepped outside. The moment I did, I felt this weird twinge in my gut. It was like the air around me got heavier, or maybe I was just suddenly on edge. It didn't feel like the usual peaceful hush you get at dusk. It was more like the land was holding its breath. I tried to brush it off and headed toward my car, which was parked a bit further from the office. As I walked, I caught a glimpse of something near the tree line. At first, I thought it might be a large deer or maybe a mountain lion, but it moved way too strangely. It was tall, with long limbs, and it disappeared behind the trees almost faster than my eyes could register. I actually froze for a second, wondering if I imagined it. But that feeling in my gut got worse, and I realized I was sweating even though the temperature had already dropped. I decided I should check it out. After all, part of my job was making sure no one was messing around in restricted areas. So I moved carefully toward the spot where I'd seen it. I didn't want to spook it, whatever it was, and I also didn't want to put myself in danger. As I approached, every sound in the forest just died. I remember thinking it was too quiet, like not even birds were calling anymore. It felt completely unnatural. Then I saw footprints, or at least what looked like footprints, in the soft dirt. They were half like animal paws and half like a person's footprints, but bigger, as if someone combined them into one strange shape. At first, I thought maybe it was just a weird trick of overlapping tracks, like if a bear had stepped in the same spot a couple times. But there was a clear shape to these prints. It sent a jolt of fear through me, because there's nothing local that leaves a print like that. I'm used to seeing coyote, deer, and even mountain lion prints, but this was different. I tried to get my phone out to take a photo, but there was no signal, typical for that part of the park. I wanted to let the Maine ranger station know something odd was going on, but I couldn't get a single bar. There was a static tension in the air, and I remember feeling almost claustrophobic, even though I was in this huge open environment. Out of nowhere, I heard a rustling in the brush behind me. It was the kind of rustle that definitely signaled something bigger than a raccoon. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I spun around, shining my flashlight, but the beam only caught the faint outlines of tree trunks and shrubs. Everything else was just shifting shadows. That was when I realized how close this thing might be, whatever it was. I decided to back off. My plan was to grab my gear from the office and head to the main guard post, where I could use the radio. The entire time I was walking, I felt like I was being watched. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I thought I saw a flicker of movement, like a silhouette disappearing behind a tree. It made my skin crawl. I heard heavy steps, almost in sync with mine, but offset by half a beat. I'd stop, and the steps would stop. Then I'd move again, and it'd follow. It was definitely tracking me, and I was terrified. When I finally got closer to the main path, I practically ran. I could hear my footsteps echo on the paved section, and the sense of relief that usually comes when you leave the dense forest didn't come at all. It was more like a warning in my head screaming, "Get out of there now!" I sprinted toward the guard station. The whole time I was sure this thing, or something, was right behind me, hidden just out of sight. I reached the small guard post, slammed the door behind me, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I scrambled to turn on the interior lights and grab the radio. Thankfully, the radio worked. I managed to get through to the local authorities for the park. I tried to keep calm, but my voice was trembling when I told them there was something roaming near the trails, something that wasn't a regular animal. The ranger on the other end sounded skeptical, but he heard the panic in my voice, and I think that got him to send help right away. It felt like forever, but it was probably only 20 minutes before a park patrol vehicle showed up. 2 of my colleagues stepped out, shining high-powered flashlights around. I went outside, feeling a bit safer now that I wasn't alone. I tried to explain everything: the silhouette, the tracks, the stalking feeling. They looked concerned, but I could tell they weren't sure what to believe. We did a quick search along the trail and found the strange footprints I had seen earlier, but now they looked partially obscured or smeared. It was enough to freak my colleagues out, though, because they knew those prints weren't normal. We spent maybe another hour looking around, but we didn't spot anything else. It was like that presence had just vanished into thin air. By the time morning came, we had called in a couple of investigators from a nearby department. They took pictures, tried to make casts of the prints, and asked me a bunch of questions, but they didn't come to any solid conclusion. They told me maybe it was a large animal that got injured, causing it to walk strangely, or maybe overlapping footprints from multiple animals made it look so bizarre. But even they admitted it didn't quite add up. Word traveled around Hampton Caves pretty fast. Some folks brought up old legends about shapeshifters or creatures that used to be rumored to live in the caves. Others insisted it was probably just a trick of the light and my imagination. But I know what I saw. I know something was following me that night, leaving those footprints, and it was smarter and more alert than any normal animal I've ever encountered. Strangest part is how it all just stopped. After that night, nobody reported seeing anything similar, and no new tracks turned up in that exact area. It's like it came and went in the span of a few hours, leaving no concrete evidence behind. Even after all these years, I'm left with more questions than answers. Every time I think back to that night, I can still feel my heart racing, and I can hear those footsteps right behind me. That's my story. I've got nothing to gain by making this up, and I'm not the type who sees aliens in every shooting star. I just know that I was there, and I experienced it. If you ever find yourself near Hampton Caves after dark, keep your eyes open, and maybe stay close to your radio. Something's out there, and I can't explain it to this day. Story 5. My name is Ezekiel Hawthorne, and this happened a few years ago when my friend Peril O'Sullivan and I decided to tow our trailer out to a remote spot near the Grand Canyon. We were both tired of city life and wanted a few days surrounded by nothing but canyon walls, open sky, and the weirdly beautiful silence you only get in the desert. We set up our little camp not too far from a steep overlook, where the rock formations looked endless, and the sunset melted over the horizon. It felt like stepping into another reality, calm, freeing, and just a bit haunting if I'm being honest. On our second morning out there, after a mostly uneventful first night, other than some distant howling that might have been coyotes, we decided to do a short hike. It was early enough that the desert sun wasn't trying to melt us, and the air had this crisp stillness that felt almost sacred. We were maybe an hour away from our trailer, walking along a sandy path toward a lower area of the canyon, when we saw something off in the distance, a gleam of metal half buried in a sandy patch. As we got closer, we realized it was an old, damaged vehicle, kind of lodged in a shallow ditch. We called out, checking if anybody needed help. There was no answer. The car's side windows were smashed, and the trunk was popped open. Junk was scattered around, an old shirt, some faded brochures, a torn baseball cap. It looked like it had been there for a while, but there were fresh tracks around it, almost like footprints, though it was tough to be sure in the dirt. We scanned the area, expecting to see someone hunched over or maybe lying nearby, but we found nobody. It really messed with my head. Seeing that car felt wrong, like it didn't belong. Peril and I stood there a bit, debating what to do. There was zero signal on our phones, so we figured we'd go back to our camp, pack up some supplies, and maybe drive closer to the nearest ranger station or find a spot with cell service. But the truth is, it unsettled us enough that we weren't exactly eager to stick around for a second look. So we made our way back, telling each other it was probably an old accident. Maybe someone got picked up already. But the footprints, if that's what they were, made me doubt my own explanations. That evening, the desert heat eased into a cool breeze, and the skies went from brilliant orange to a star-filled darkness. Peril started a fire just outside the trailer, and we tried to shake off the uneasy feeling from earlier. We talked about normal stuff, work, life, complaining about the lack of cold drinks. But the mood was definitely heavier than the night before. We both kept looking around, listening for any weird sounds. The emptiness that had been comforting at first now felt almost threatening. At some point, we heard what sounded like someone walking around near the trailer. It wasn't just a random rustle, it was deliberate steps, slow and careful. My heart rate shot up, and Peral went quiet. We exchanged looks, stood up, and used our flashlights to scan around. That's when we saw a figure, maybe 30 feet away, half concealed by the shadows. I couldn't see his face well, but he looked disheveled, dirty clothes, hair all over the place, an odd hunched posture like he was in pain. We called out, asking if he was okay, and telling him to keep some distance. He didn't respond. He just kind of stared at us with this vacant look. Finally, he took a few steps toward the trailer, and at that point, Peral whispered to me that maybe it was the driver of that crashed vehicle. Something about him felt off, like he wasn't just a lost hiker. We offered help, told him we could get him water or first aid. He still didn't say a word, just sort of mumbled something I couldn't catch, then lunged at our trailer door. A wave of panic rushed through me. The only real protection we had was the trailer itself and a metal tire iron that Peral grabbed. We managed to shove the door closed before he could wedge himself inside. He pushed back hard, making these frantic, guttural sounds, and the trailer creaked like it might give way at any second. I yelled at him to stop, to get back, but his voice rose to a shrill moan I can still hear when I think about it. He wasn't yelling words, just this disturbing wail that made my whole body tense up with fear. By some miracle, we forced him away from the door long enough to secure the lock. The trailer windows rattled as he thumped on the sides, scratching at the metal like an animal. I remember standing there, my palms sweaty, adrenaline racing, and I genuinely thought he might break in. My brain kept flashing to that wrecked car. If he had been inside that thing, how had he survived? And why was he acting like some cornered wild creature? Eventually, the banging stopped for a moment. We turned off any lights inside, crouched down, and tried to peek out through the blinds. The campfire was still smoldering, illuminating the area with a dim glow. We could just make out his silhouette pacing around. He circled the trailer, coming in and out of view, muttering, occasionally letting out these muffled grunts or nonsense phrases. Each time he passed a window, I thought my heart would jump out of my chest. I lost track of how long we stayed there, listening to him shuffle and mumble, but it felt like hours. We had no cell signal, and there was no way we were stepping outside to drive off with him skulking around. We whispered to each other, planning out worst-case scenarios. Peral tightened his grip on the tire iron, and I tried to think of anything else we could use as a weapon. The trailer suddenly felt much smaller, with walls that might as well have been paper for how safe I felt. The man's footfalls eventually grew softer, like he was moving farther away. But even then, we couldn't relax. Any time I let my guard down, I'd hear a new scrape or sniffle outside. He just wouldn't leave. We were stuck in this nerve-wracking limbo until the faintest hint of dawn showed through the windows. As soon as we saw that glow, we decided we had to try for higher ground where we might catch a cell signal. We waited for his footsteps to fade into the distance, grabbed whatever we could, and quietly cracked open the trailer door. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would give us away. The campfire was out, leaving only a faint smell of ash in the chilly morning air. We scanned the perimeter for any sign of him. I spotted footprints circling the trailer in the dirt, tracks that looked like he'd just been wandering around in some frantic pattern all night long. But we didn't see him anywhere. We quickly made our way up a small rocky slope behind our campsite. My legs were shaking from a mix of stress and fatigue, but relief washed over me when I finally got a single bar of service on my phone. I called the local police, rambling about this guy who was acting completely unhinged. To their credit, they took it seriously, probably because we sounded terrified, and they said they'd send a patrol as soon as possible. Peril and I hovered there, scanning the area, dreading the moment we'd see him again. By the time the sun was fully up, a single police SUV managed to find our makeshift camp. I saw the officers get out, one with a hand on his sidearm, the other calling out to see if anyone was around. They spotted the man near a cluster of small boulders, not too far from our trailer. He seemed dazed in the daylight, like he had no idea what was happening. The officers approached him carefully, and he tried to resist a little, flailing his arms in a weak attempt. They managed to get him to sit and calm down, though he still mumbled incoherently. I overheard something about him needing medical attention and that he might have a history of mental health issues. The cops asked us a few questions, took our statements, and told us they'd escort him to a hospital. There was no big dramatic showdown. It ended almost as abruptly as it began, which in some ways was even more unsettling. One moment we were barricaded in our trailer, expecting the worst, and the next thing we knew, we were watching him get loaded into the back of the police SUV, his eyes still vacant, not really registering what was going on. We stayed behind while the officers drove away, just staring at each other, not sure how to process it. That day, we decided we'd had enough of the wild for a while. We packed up the trailer and headed back to the nearest town, just wanting a hot meal and some reassurance we hadn't lost our minds. We spoke briefly with another officer who took some more details, suggested we think twice about camping so remotely without a better plan for emergencies, and told us they'd keep us informed if they discovered anything about that car and the man's condition. I never really found out what happened, who he was, how he'd ended up out there, or why he acted like we were his worst enemies. Even now I get a cold, uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach when I remember his face pressed against the trailer window, the desperate way he tried to break in, the eerie chanting that I still can't quite put into words. Every once in a while, when I see a deserted stretch of desert or a lone car on a dirt road, I'm reminded of that night and how quickly a peaceful escape can turn into something terrifying. It just happened, and then, in a flash, it was over. I have no real explanation, only the memory of that hollow look in his eyes and the lingering question of what else might be lurking out there in those empty expanses. Story 6. My name is Reyes Carver, and back in 2011, I was assigned to a specialized security unit that ended up in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. I remember stepping out of our vehicle that morning and feeling the desert sun hit my face like a warning. The town was smaller than I expected. Quiet streets, sparse traffic, and an odd kind of stillness. We were there to locate someone rumored to be running illegal experiments, but honestly, I didn't think much of it at first. I'd been on countless missions, and they usually turned out pretty mundane. That day, though, everything went off the rails in a way I still can't fully explain. We got intel that led us to a rundown warehouse on the outskirts. From the outside, it looked like any old storage building, rusted metal, half-broken windows, and a fence that was practically disintegrating. But once we stepped inside, I realized we weren't dealing with typical criminals. The space was almost empty, no crates, no obvious contraband, yet the floor was covered in these deep scratches, like something with claws had scraped across the concrete. I remember kneeling down and running my fingers over the grooves. They were too wide and too uneven to be from a regular tool. My gut started churning. Something was off. While my teammates swept each corner, I noticed big, twisted marks on the metal support beams. It was like giant talons had tried to grip them, digging in so hard the metal bent. I'd never seen anything like it. My first thought was maybe someone used specialized equipment to stage a hoax, but that didn't explain the footprints we found next. A pattern of prints that almost looked human at a glance, but then they'd branch out like an animal's hind legs. Our usual protocol suddenly felt useless. We were trained to handle armed suspects, not whatever left those tracks. After securing the warehouse, we moved outside to a nearby lot. It was mostly tumbleweeds and dry dirt, but we found the same strange footprints leading away from the building. We decided to follow them before the wind erased all evidence. I kept scanning the horizon, half expecting to see a coyote or something else common in the desert. Instead, we caught a glimpse of movement behind a row of old tires stacked against a bent fence. We pointed our flashlights, and I swear for a split second, something tall and hunched darted out of view. It was fast, too fast to track properly in that half-light. Our team spread out in a semicircle, trying to corner whatever it was. The tension was suffocating. Each step made my heartbeat pound in my ears. That's when we heard a low scraping noise on the other side of the fence, like claws dragging on metal. One of the guys called out that he saw a shape slip behind a rusted truck shell, and we all converged on it. But by the time we got there, it was gone. Just silence and a chill in the air that didn't match the day's heat. We decided to regroup and check the inside of the warehouse again, thinking maybe there was a hidden space we missed. Tucked in the corner, behind a stack of warped pallets, we found a hatch that led to a sub-level. No one had noticed it at first because the hatch door looked like part of the concrete floor. We pried it open and descended into a cramped passage that smelled like mildew and something foul, almost chemical. The corridor was lined with flickering lights. My heart hammered because part of me was terrified we'd come face to face with whatever left those marks. At the end of the passage, there was a room with a couple of metal tables and shelves crammed with papers. Some documents were in code, others had sketches of creatures that didn't look fully human, or fully animal either. I spotted references to hybrid strains and mutation trials. The deeper I read, the sicker I felt. It looked like someone was splicing genetic material and maybe releasing test subjects into the wild. Or maybe something had escaped on its own. Either way, this was bigger than a simple takedown mission. We heard a metallic bang from somewhere above us, followed by a long scraping sound. Our backup posted at ground level radioed that they saw movement inside the warehouse again. We grabbed all the documents we could carry and rushed upstairs. The place was still deserted, but the old metal door at the far end was now ripped open, leaving twisted shards. More of those bizarre claw marks snaked across the interior walls. It was like we were always 2 steps behind whatever we were chasing. Outside, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows on the desert floor. We felt exposed, like easy targets. So we pushed forward, scanning every direction with night vision goggles. That's when one of our sensors picked up motion near a cluster of abandoned vehicles. A faint beep, then another. We sprinted over, hearts pounding. All we found were jagged scratches across the ground and more footprints. No sign of the creature. It was as if it wanted us to see evidence of its presence but not catch it in the act. By this point, we were all on edge. Even the guys who usually stay calm were wide-eyed and gripping their gear way too tight. The next move was to contact our superiors and lock down the area. Our orders were to keep the locals unaware, but word was probably getting out anyway because a couple of residents approached us, asking if we'd seen the monster they'd heard rumors about. People in this town had apparently whispered about odd sightings for weeks, but nobody took them seriously. Now we had proof something was definitely wandering around. As the night wore on, we set up a quick perimeter, but there was no trace of the creature. The footprints vanished into rocky terrain that our equipment couldn't navigate well in the dark. We decided we'd done all we could for the moment. I remember standing there, sweat mixing with the cool night air, my hands shaking, still holding my flashlight in a death grip. Part of me was relieved we hadn't been attacked. Another part of me was frustrated we couldn't confirm exactly what we were dealing with. Eventually, our higher-ups told us to seal off the sub-level, secure the documents, and evacuate the scene. I felt this strange combination of dread and emptiness, like we were leaving behind a puzzle we might never solve. We'd found enough evidence to prove illegal experiments, but not enough to fully explain that creature, or how it seemed to vanish at will. The rest of the team looked just as unsettled. We quietly packed up our gear and left under the cover of darkness, half expecting to see glowing eyes peering at us from the shadows. That was the end of it. We didn't stay another night in Truth or Consequences. We filed our reports, which all ended up watered down to factors unknown. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that whatever we stumbled on was still out there, prowling around that dusty landscape. And the fact that it all happened so suddenly, like a glimpse behind a curtain, makes it even creepier. I've seen some wild stuff in my career, but nothing that unsettled me quite like that. Even now, I get chills thinking about those deep claw marks and those footprints that defied logic. It felt like we only scratched the surface of a secret no one was supposed to discover, and then it vanished back into the darkness without leaving any solid answers behind. Story 7. I remember waking up that morning with a weird knot in my stomach. It was mid-October 2003, and I was deep in the Rocky Mountains, miles away from any paved road or official campsite. My name is Byron Hartley, and I had decided to disappear into the wilderness for a while to clear my head. I'd spent the previous days wandering along remote trails, using old maps and my own experience to navigate. Up until then, it had mostly been peaceful, crisp autumn air, golden leaves, and the kind of solitude that makes you question why you ever lived around noise and crowds. But on that particular morning, something just felt wrong. I broke camp at dawn. The sky was a dull grey, and the birds that usually made noise around sunrise were strangely silent. As I packed up my gear, I felt like someone was standing behind me, but every time I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing. It was just me, my tent, and the tall pines. Shrugging it off, I started following the next leg of my route. I checked my map, noted a clearing a few miles ahead, and decided that would be a good place to rest and take a quick snack break. The hike there was unnervingly quiet. Even in remote areas, you usually pick up on the sounds of nature, rustling leaves, small critters scurrying about. But that day, it felt like everything was holding its breath. The silence became so heavy that I actually found myself whispering to myself, just to break it. When I finally reached the clearing, it struck me immediately how lifeless the place felt. The grass looked wilted, and no wind seemed to blow through. It was that kind of moment when the hair on the back of your neck stands up for no clear reason. In the center of that clearing, I saw these massive footprints. When I say massive, I mean at least twice the size of my own boots, and I'm not a small guy. They looked fresh, like they'd been made recently, but there were no other footprints around them, just those huge impressions in the dirt. I felt my heart thumping in my chest. The first thought that crossed my mind was that maybe a very large bear had passed through. But I'd seen bear prints before, and these were shaped differently, more like human footprints, but way bigger. My stomach turned at the possibility that it could be something else, but I forced myself to keep calm. Telling myself I was overreacting, I hurried on toward the next landmark. The day wore on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but it was never anything I could pinpoint. I wanted to rationalize it. Maybe a deer, maybe shadows from the swaying branches, but it didn't sit right with me. Around midday, I needed to refill my water, so I cut through a small ravine toward a creek indicated on the map. That's when I stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. There were items scattered everywhere, a torn backpack, a small pot, and a rolled-up sleeping bag that was partially unrolled, as if someone had yanked it out in a hurry. The fire ring was cold to the touch, so it wasn't like they had just left moments ago. Still, the whole scene felt urgent. like whoever had been there had bolted with no time to pack. I stood there, scanning the area for any clue of what might have happened. No fresh footprints stood out except, again, one large print near the edge of the campsite. It made my blood run cold, because it looked exactly like the ones I'd seen earlier in the clearing. I don't mind admitting I was scared, and I'm usually the type of person who can keep it together, especially outdoors. But this was different. Every fiber of my being was screaming that something was off. I remember the sweat beading on my forehead, even though the air was getting cold. I tried checking my phone, hoping against all odds for a signal, but of course there was none. That's the downside of going so far off the grid. No contact with the outside world. Feeling a jolt of panic, I decided it was time to head back toward more familiar territory. I was done exploring. As I made my way out of the campsite, I swore I heard footsteps in the distance, heavy ones that broke branches. I froze in place, half expecting some massive animal to burst through the tree line, but the sound just faded away. My heart pounded in my ears. I kept walking, trying to stay calm, telling myself that animals wander around all the time. But deep down, I couldn't shake the thought that something, or someone, was deliberately messing with me. The climb up a small ridge was next. I figured if I got high enough, maybe I could see over the tree line and find a quicker path out. The trail got steeper, and my legs were burning. The further up I went, the more I realized how quickly the weather can shift in the Rockies. Clouds rolled in, dark and heavy, making the whole forest dimmer. I started feeling claustrophobic in all that gloom, but I pushed on. My only goal was to get somewhere safe before nightfall. Near the top of the ridge, I stopped to catch my breath. That's when I spotted it. A massive, hulking shape about 100 yards to my left, partially hidden by pine trees. I couldn't make out its face, just a big silhouette. It looked tall, but the branches made it hard to gauge its full height. My mind immediately jumped to that giant footprint. I remember this wave of dread washing over me, and I felt my fingers shaking on my trekking pole. I stayed perfectly still, hoping it wouldn't notice me. I could barely breathe. After a few seconds, the figure moved sideways, almost gliding behind the trees, and disappeared from sight. My first instinct was to bolt, but instead I forced myself to crouch down and wait, listening for any sign of movement. That silence returned, heavier than before, like the forest was working against me. It felt like hours, but it was probably just a minute or two before I convinced myself it was safe to keep going. I scrambled over the ridge, practically sliding on loose gravel. My lungs were burning, and I couldn't get rid of this creeping sensation that I was being chased. Every time a branch snapped or a rock slid under my boot, I jumped. I didn't see that massive shape again, but I could feel its presence, like it was following me from a distance. When I finally descended on the other side, I found a narrow pathway that, according to my map, led toward a forest patrol station. I had hoped someone might be there, or at least I could find a radio and call for help. It was late afternoon now, the light fading, and part of me was terrified I'd never find the station before night set in. But I kept pushing forward, forcing my body through the exhaustion. After about an hour of trudging, I came across a small wooden sign pointing toward a patrol outpost. My spirits lifted a bit. I started walking faster, even though I was dead tired. That's when I heard a noise behind me, this low, resonating grunt that I could feel in my chest. I whipped around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, so I half ran, half hiked, stumbling over roots and rocks until the trees thinned out and I spotted a small cabin up ahead. The patrol station looked empty, but the door was unlocked. Inside it was dim, just a lantern left on the table and a few chairs. My voice shook as I called out, hoping someone was there. Nobody answered. By now I was trembling from both the cold and the fear. I locked the door behind me and sat down, trying to gather my thoughts. A radio sat on the table, but it crackled with static whenever I turned the dial. I had no way of reaching anyone. I can't explain the exact moment it happened, but I felt a shift in the air, almost like the pressure changed. I heard heavy footsteps outside circling the cabin. They were slow and purposeful, like it was testing each step. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure it would hear me. I turned off the lantern, staying completely still in the darkness. The footsteps paused on the porch, right near the door. I remember holding my breath, my entire body tense. Then, nothing. No sound, no movement. It was like whatever stood outside was waiting for me to make the first move. I don't know how long I sat there, maybe minutes, maybe an hour. My mind raced with thoughts. Would it break the door down? Should I run? But eventually, the footsteps started again, this time moving away. I heard them crunch on the gravel until they disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. I just stayed in that patrol station, eyes fixed on the door. At some point, the first light of dawn crept through the small windows. It was still eerily quiet outside. When I finally got the courage to check, there was no sign of footprints on the porch, no visible damage, nothing. It was like the whole thing had just evaporated. Later that morning, 2 park rangers showed up. They looked at me like I was half crazy when I told them what happened. But they listened anyway, and I could see concern in their eyes when I mentioned the giant footprints and the abandoned campsite. They went out to investigate. I waited at the station, my nerves frayed. When they returned, they didn't find anything conclusive. Sure, they found a campsite, but it had been rained on recently, and there were no huge footprints left. They told me it could have been a bear. I didn't argue. I was just desperate to leave those mountains. I hiked out with the rangers, and I've never returned to that region since. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard. Sometimes I wonder if it was my own mind playing tricks on me after days of solitude. But then I remember how real the fear was, how clear those giant footprints appeared in the mud. It all started and ended so abruptly. One moment, I felt relatively safe out there, and then suddenly I was in the most unnerving experience of my life. Even now, whenever I look at a map of the Rocky Mountains, I get this uneasy feeling, like a reminder that the wilderness can hide things we're just not prepared to understand. I'm still not sure what was out there that day. I only know it shook me in a way that nothing else ever has, and it never really left me. I can still hear those heavy footsteps outside the patrol station whenever I think back on that October afternoon, and I doubt I'll ever find a good explanation for it. Sometimes it's enough just to acknowledge that the mountains keep their secrets, and we might never uncover them all. Story 8. I still remember that day so clearly. It was late afternoon, and the sky was hinting that dusk was coming soon. Kevin and I were on a routine assignment in Devil's Den National Park, responding to odd reports of unidentified sounds in one of the more remote sections of the park. We'd gotten calls about strange, low-pitched growls or moans echoing through the trees. Normally, we'd brush it off as a bear or maybe a cougar, but something about the urgency in the voices of the people who reported it left us both a little uneasy. The trail leading to the reported area was rough and rarely used, which meant we had the place mostly to ourselves. It was typical search and rescue procedure. We walked side by side, scanning our surroundings, calling out occasionally in case someone was in trouble. The forest was thick, and the tree canopy made the dimming light feel like the onset of nighttime. Not long after we got deeper into the woods, we stumbled onto a campsite that looked abandoned, almost like whoever was there had left in a hurry. Equipment was scattered around, some pots, half a tent, a couple of backpacks. Nothing was set up neatly, and no one answered our calls. Immediately my heart started pounding with a familiar anxiety. I'd seen deserted camps before, but usually there were signs someone had moved on, footprints, a sense of order. This looked more like people had bolted in the middle of something. Kevin crouched to examine a small tear in one of the tents. He wasn't sure if it was from a wild animal or a snag on a tree branch, but he didn't like the look of it. I remember he gave me a quick, tense glance. In our line of work, we take mental notes when things feel off, and this whole situation just felt wrong. We began a brief search of the immediate area. There was a sort of hush in the woods. Even the birds and usual forest noise seemed muffled, like everything was on edge. Kevin stepped away, looking around the other side of a thicket, and that's when I heard it. This deep, guttural growl. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Kevin froze and motioned for me to stay put. He'd been around bigger wildlife more than I had, so I trusted his instincts. Normally, we'd just carefully withdraw if we thought a bear was nearby. But something about that growl didn't sound normal. It was almost too low, too resonant, like it was coming from something bigger than anything I'd heard out here. We kept our voices low and started making our way back toward the main trail. The sun was almost gone, and the forest was turning that weird gray color before full dark sets in. Our flashlights gave us these narrow beams of visibility, but I felt like anything could be lurking just outside their reach. Then we heard it again, another growl, closer this time. It sounded like it was circling us, or maybe there were two of them. We couldn't be sure. Kevin raised his flashlight, and for just a split second, I saw a dark shape move between the trees. It was big, definitely bigger than a person, and it moved in this unsettlingly smooth way. It made no noise except for a slight rustling of leaves. My stomach dropped. I felt a wave of cold panic because every instinct told me that whatever was out there, it wasn't just a lost animal. We moved faster, trying not to trip in the semi-darkness. Kevin signaled for me to be ready to run if needed. By the time we found the path back to the abandoned camp, we were both breathing hard. The temperature seemed to plummet as the night really set in. The rotting leaves on the ground made it slippery, and I nearly fell a couple of times. That's when I felt something rush past me, like a fast shadow. It went by so quickly that my flashlight barely caught a glimpse. It looked dark and elongated, almost like a large cat, but something about its silhouette was off. It was too tall, maybe, or the way it hunched made it look unnaturally stretched out. Kevin whispered something like, "We need to go, now." We kept our flashlights pointed at every direction we could, trying to keep track of the movement around us, but it was like chasing ghosts in the dark. Whatever it was smart. It never fully stepped into the beam of light. We finally reached the clearing where we'd parked our truck. It felt like a breath of relief to see the vehicle, but the relief vanished in an instant when we realized we still had to radio the base. Kevin fumbled with the radio, and my adrenaline was so high I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. I kept spinning around, trying to watch our backs. The growling had stopped, but there was this eerie silence, almost like the forest was waiting for something. When the radio crackled to life and we got through to the station, Kevin's voice was shaking. He requested immediate backup. He didn't give specifics, just said there was a possible large predator and an abandoned campsite. They told us they'd send a team with stronger flashlights, traps, and everything else they'd need for a large animal encounter. We stayed put, barely breathing, until the backup finally arrived. Felt like ages, but in reality, maybe 20 or 30 minutes passed. When the rangers pulled up with their lights, I almost collapsed with relief. Our team quickly split up into small groups to sweep the area. They had these powerful spotlights that turned night into day in certain spots, but that sense of unease still clung to everything. We searched around the campsite and found the same bizarre mess we'd seen before. gear strewn about, no footprints that made any sense, no blood, nothing. A few broken branches, but you could chalk that up to anything. Some of the guys found unusual scratches on a couple of tree trunks, deep and wide enough to suggest a large set of claws. Still, no one could figure out what kind of animal would leave marks like that in this specific pattern. We fanned out, scanning the perimeter, calling out, waiting to hear the growl or any sign that the creature was still around. But it was gone. It was like it had vanished into thin air. After we regrouped, the lead ranger decided we had enough reason to lock down the area for a while. As we headed back, everyone was buzzing with speculation. Maybe it was a bear, maybe a big cat, or something else. But none of us really believed those explanations. Not one of us had ever heard something quite like that growl, and the speed it moved at seemed beyond normal. Over the next few hours, we set up some trail cameras and posted warnings to keep hikers away. Kevin and I stayed behind to help the night patrol, but the growls didn't return. The motion sensors never went off. It was like the whole thing just stopped. That night, we barely slept. I kept expecting another rush of movement through the shadows, but nothing happened. For weeks afterward, Kevin and I checked those cameras and scoured the area with different teams. Apart from some random footprints that didn't match any known wildlife in the region, there was nothing. No more sightings, no more bizarre sounds. It was as if that creature, or whatever it was, had come out of nowhere, terrified everyone, and then disappeared without a trace. To this day, I still get chills thinking about that abandoned campsite. I try to imagine what those campers must have felt right before they left all their stuff behind. Whatever was out there with us that evening, I can't explain it with any animal I know. It never behaved like anything I've encountered before or since. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself replaying that moment when I saw that dark shape sliding between the trees. I wonder if my mind was just playing tricks on me, or if something genuinely unexplainable was prowling those woods. Officially, the park just warns people that there might be a large predator in the area, but no one's ever been able to give a definitive answer. And the campers who vanished that day never surfaced to clarify what happened. I don't have an explanation. I only know what I saw, what I heard, and how it made me feel, small, vulnerable, and absolutely terrified. Even though the search eventually ended and people moved on to other tasks, that feeling never left. Sometimes in the back of my head, I can still hear that low, haunting growl echoing through the trees, and I can't shake the idea that whatever it was might still be out there, waiting in the dense cover of Devil's Den, ready to vanish again into the darkness the moment someone tries to find it. Story 9. Back in 2010, I was assigned to a special investigation near West Glacier, Montana. I still remember how the air felt that morning, thin, almost electric, like something was humming just beneath the surface. My unit had sent me and my colleague, Dr. Amelia Sutton, to check on rumors of odd experiments supposedly happening deep in the woods. We arrived early, hoping to wrap things up before dark, but nothing went according to plan. The day started quietly enough. The park looked postcard perfect, with tall pines and snow-capped peaks in the distance. Amelia and I drove in a nondescript SUV down a winding dirt road. We had only the basics, our badges, some field gear, and a vague report about sightings of strange animal-human hybrids roaming near abandoned facilities. I remember feeling a bit skeptical. At the same time, I couldn't shake this underlying tension in the pit of my stomach. We spent the morning interviewing a local ranger who mentioned that an old shed sat deeper in the forest, supposedly left to rot years ago. But he swore he'd seen fresh footprints around it. Some looked almost human, others not quite. He was rattled. When we asked more about it, he shut down fast, like he'd said too much already. That was enough for us to go investigate. We found the shed around mid-afternoon. It was tucked among thick trees, almost hidden by overgrown bushes and vines. It had no obvious path leading to it, which made me wonder how anyone could use it frequently without leaving more of a trail. Inside, the place was larger than it seemed from the outside. The walls were lined with old shelves filled with canisters and tubes, some labeled with numbers, others with symbols I didn't recognize. At first glance, it looked like a makeshift lab, or at least part of one. Some of the equipment seemed brand new, like someone had dropped it off recently. I tried telling myself it could be legitimate research, but there was this uneasy feeling I just couldn't ignore. Amelia carefully examined the containers while I checked for any signs of who might have been there before us. I remember noticing a sticky residue on one of the tables. It looked almost like translucent gel. That was when I got hit with a horrible smell, chemical and rotten at the same time. It clung to the air and to my clothes. It gave me goosebumps. I waved for Amelia to come over, but she was already staring at a half-open freezer box with something dark and slimy inside. She just looked at me, eyes wide. We didn't say a word, but the fear was plain on our faces. That was when everything got eerily quiet outside. The birds stopped singing, and even the insects seemed to vanish. It felt like stepping into a vacuum. I heard something shuffle behind the shed, followed by a low, throaty growl. I froze, and Amelia went pale. We had come prepared for trouble, but we weren't expecting whatever was making that sound. I motioned for Amelia to stay low while I edged toward the door. Poking my head out, I caught a glimpse of movement in the trees. I couldn't see it clearly at first. It was just a big shape darting between trunks. Then I saw the outline. It stood on two legs, but hunched forward, its arms unnaturally long and muscular, with a strange grayish skin. It was fast, almost graceful in a twisted way. My chest tightened, like my body knew it wasn't supposed to see something like this. It let out a soft grunt, and that was enough for Amelia to step back. I could see her trembling. I was too. We'd dealt with dangerous animals before, but this felt different. This thing was watching us, and I had this gut feeling that if it decided to come closer, we'd be done. We radioed for backup, barely getting a clear signal out. Our team was in range, thankfully, and told us they'd be there as soon as they could. While we waited, we just stood there, alert, scanning the tree line. Every now and then, I spotted its shape weaving in and out of the dense foliage. Sometimes it would vanish, and I'd hope it was gone. But then I'd see a flicker of movement again. It felt like a game of cat and mouse, but I couldn't tell who was the cat and who was the mouse. Before long, a couple of our team members arrived with additional gear and tranquilizer rifles. They spread out quietly, trying not to spook whatever was out there. We were all straining our ears, listening for that low growl or rustling leaves. But then, nothing. The forest seemed dead again. We fanned out, searching the perimeter for tracks or fur or anything that might give us a lead on where this creature disappeared to. But it was like it had never been there. No footprints, no broken branches, no smell. The quiet was even more unsettling than the growl had been. We regrouped, all of us on edge, and decided to do a more thorough sweep of the shed. We photographed the weird equipment and the containers, took samples of that odd residue, and labeled everything for evidence. But I couldn't ignore how the hair on the back of my neck refused to lie flat. I still felt watched, like 1,000 eyes were on us from beyond the tree line. It started getting late, and we knew we couldn't keep searching in the dark. We secured the area and set up a small makeshift base near the entrance to the trail. A few of the guys stayed behind, waiting for specialized teams to take over. Amelia and I were told to head back and file our initial report. My nerves were still rattled, and on the drive out, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that grey figure sprinting after us. By the time I got back to my temporary lodging, I could barely process what had happened. My mind kept replaying the image of that hunched creature, how it moved, and how the forest went silent in its presence. I wondered if it was some freak of nature, or if we had really stumbled onto something more sinister, like a messed-up experiment that had escaped. In the weeks that followed, the official stance was that there wasn't enough evidence to prove anything illegal was going on. No one talked about the possible creature, and the bizarre lab gear was chalked up to some unauthorized research. But I knew what I saw. Amelia knew too. Even if we lacked solid proof, that day will always haunt me. There's something out in those woods that I can't explain, and I doubt I ever will. I still think about that low growl sometimes, how it sounded almost human in a terrifying way. Even now, I get chills remembering how that thing vanished without leaving a trace. It happened so fast, and then it was over, like the forest swallowed it up. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that someone or something is keeping secrets in that park. And every time I close my eyes, I can picture that grey silhouette slipping back into the shadows, as if it was never really there in the first place. Story 10. I remember waking up that morning in 2012, feeling a weird sense of unease. Our team had set up a makeshift base inside this old, abandoned building on the outskirts of Owl Hollow, West Virginia. The air felt thick, like a thunderstorm was about to roll in, but the sky was clear. We'd been in town for a few days investigating some strange occurrences around the old mining areas, but that day, something felt different. We started out by organizing our gear, mostly flashlights, radios, and the basic stuff we use when we're inspecting rough terrain. There was a stale smell in that abandoned building that I couldn't ignore. It reminded me of damp earth mixed with rotting leaves. It seemed like every corner of Owl Hollow carried that same scent, a constant reminder of the mining past and whatever else was lingering out there. Around mid-morning, we headed out toward one of the old trails that led up into the hills. The path was narrow, and we had to move single file. I was in the middle of the group, trying to keep my eyes on the dense tree line while listening to any unusual noises. The birds were strangely silent, which always makes me anxious, like they know something's off. After about an hour of steady hiking, we noticed this bizarre stretch of disturbed ground, like something heavy had been dragged across the path. The dirt looked fresh, the leaves scattered in odd patterns. I knelt down to get a closer look and realized there were these deep furrows in the soil, almost like claw marks. But they were too far apart to be from a standard animal you'd expect in those woods. No one said it out loud, but we all shared a look that screamed, "This isn't normal." We kept following that trail, our radios crackling with updates from each other. The further we went, the darker it seemed to get under the canopy. It was almost midday, but it felt like twilight. That's when we started catching these rancid whiffs of something I can only describe as old, wet fur. It came in waves, strong enough to make my stomach churn. My colleague up front paused suddenly, so I nearly walked right into him. He pointed to a tree trunk. Deep, jagged scratches ran up its side, at least 7 feet off the ground. The bark was splintered in a way I'd never seen before, and there was some kind of slimy residue in the grooves. We couldn't tell if it was sap mixed with something else, but it definitely wasn't normal tree sap. A few minutes later, we heard this distinct snapping sound, like a branch breaking under pressure. Everyone froze. I strained my eyes, scanning the bushes. Nothing moved, but my heart was hammering so loud I was sure the others could hear it. We stayed still for what felt like forever before we continued on. Eventually, we reached the mouth of what used to be an old mine entrance. The beams were collapsed, and the entrance looked unstable. We found a few discarded tools, rusted shovels, broken lanterns, stuff you'd expect in a derelict mining town, but something about that spot felt off, like we were being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill despite the muggy air. While we were examining the debris, I noticed this trail of footprints off to the side, only they weren't exactly footprints, more like elongated paw prints with an odd shape. The front part looked almost human, but the back was extended with a weird curve. I called out to the rest of the team, and we gathered around. No one could make sense of it. They were spaced as though something on two legs had walked through, but the imprint was far too large to be a person's foot. That's when we heard a shrill cry echo from deeper in the woods. It was sharp, almost metallic, and it stopped us cold. We stood there, flashlights and cameras in hand, waiting for it to happen again. My pulse was racing, and I could feel the adrenaline surging. One of my teammates whispered if we should head back, but we all knew we needed to check it out. This was the kind of thing we'd come here for. We pushed further up the slope, following the sound. The smell got worse, almost suffocating. Suddenly, we reached this small clearing. It was littered with broken branches and patches of flattened grass, as if something big had been pacing in circles. At the far edge, right before the trees closed in again, I caught a glimpse of movement, something tall and lean disappearing behind the trunk of a massive pine. My heart nearly stopped. I could have sworn it was standing upright, but hunched, with an elongated shape that made no sense. One of us tried to snap a photo, but the camera jammed or malfunctioned, I'm not sure which. Panic started to set in. We all felt it. It wasn't just the sight of that figure, it was the crushing silence that followed. No insects, no birds, not even wind, just our breathing. I stepped toward that pine tree, even though every instinct told me to get the hell out of there. The undergrowth was thick, and I nearly tripped on a fallen log. I could feel eyes on me, like there was something behind every shadow. We found broken branches, more odd tracks, but the figure itself was gone. By now the sun was dipping lower, and the forest was getting dimmer. We decided we'd gathered enough evidence for one day. The sense of dread was overwhelming, and we didn't want to risk getting caught out there in total darkness. As we retraced our steps, the forest felt even more claustrophobic. Every few minutes we heard faint rustling behind us, but we never saw anything concrete. It was like playing a game of cat and mouse, except we had no clue what the cat really was. We made it back to our base just after dusk. The building seemed even more foreboding than usual, but at least it was some sort of shelter. We laid out our gear and checked what we managed to record. Most of the photos were useless, blurred by movement or maybe some camera glitch. The audio had odd clicks and interference. It was frustrating, because we knew we'd witnessed something incredible, something terrifying, and yet we had almost nothing to prove it. Later that evening, while we were sorting through notes, we all heard this unearthly howl echo through the town. It reverberated off the walls, loud enough to rattle the boarded-up windows. We rushed to look outside, but the streets were empty. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. No footsteps, no sign of anything in the darkness, just the ghostly silence of an abandoned road. That night, I couldn't sleep. I laid on a makeshift cot, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with the day's events. The fear, the uncertainty, the nagging feeling that something was lurking just outside. That was all too real. When I finally did doze off, I had a nightmare about those distorted footprints leading me in circles. I jolted awake more than once, convinced I heard scratching at the door, but whenever I got up to check, there was only stillness. We stayed in Owl Hollow a bit longer after that, but honestly, I'll never forget that day. It felt like I was on the edge of uncovering a secret older than the town itself, yet everything kept slipping through my fingers. I still don't have a logical explanation for what we heard or what I saw crouching behind that pine tree. Maybe there was some animal that adapted in those abandoned mines, or maybe it was something else entirely, something that doesn't want to be found. Even now, thinking about it sends a chill through me. There was a moment in that clearing when I was sure I was being watched by something I couldn't reason with. And just like it started, it all seemed to end abruptly. No final confrontation, no undeniable proof, just echoes in the woods and fading tracks in the dirt. Until today, I haven't been able to shake that eerie feeling that whatever was out there is still roaming around Owl Hollow, waiting for the next person who dares to go looking for it. Story 11. I remember that morning in 2014 like it happened yesterday. My team and I arrived in Truth Falls, New Mexico, as part of a specialized security group meant to investigate strange occurrences. We'd heard rumors about suspicious activities around the town, but I honestly didn't expect anything extraordinary. The place seemed too quiet, almost like the residents wanted to avoid giving any information. Something felt off from the start, but we tried to keep our minds focused on the job. We started early, combing the outskirts of Truth Falls, where most of the abandoned buildings stood. Our brief was straightforward. Look for possible evidence of illegal experiments or dangerous substances, document everything, then move on. The day was clear but unusually still, like the wind had just stopped blowing altogether. I could hear my own breath echoing inside my ears. That's how silent it was. One of the first spots we checked was a large old warehouse near a dried-out creek. The exterior was covered in faded paint and rust. Inside, it reeked of chemicals, and the stench made my eyes water. We spotted empty glass containers, random metal tools, and odd scratch marks on the floor. I swear I could see what looked like large footprints, but they weren't shaped like any animal track I'd ever seen. They seemed almost human, but elongated, with a strange separation at the toes. Even one of my teammates, who'd worked in wildlife research before joining us, couldn't match them to any known species. As we pushed deeper into the warehouse, we found a row of shelves stacked with canisters and jars. Most were broken or emptied, and we had no clue what they once contained. Some had residue that clung to the glass like a thick, dark slime. I touched it with a gloved finger, and the texture felt gritty. It smelled sour, almost pungent like rotting fruit mixed with bleach. It made my stomach churn, but we continued searching for anything that could give us concrete answers. We spent a few hours documenting everything we could find. Daylight streamed in through the cracked windows, and the dust motes in the air flickered with each movement of our flashlights. A heaviness settled over us, like we were trespassing somewhere we didn't belong. I felt uneasy, more so than I ever had on any other job. Even the guys in my team who were normally chatty stayed quiet. After we finished inside, our orders were to survey the surrounding area, so we headed out to check the perimeter. That's when the day took a turn. About 50 yards behind the warehouse, in a patch of tall grass, we came across a torn piece of metal fencing. It looked like something with tremendous force had bent it outward. Right next to the fence, the ground was packed with those same strange footprints, as if something had stood there for a while before moving on. A bitter odor hung in the air, heavier than inside the warehouse, almost electrical. I felt my skin crawl. It was unlike anything I'd encountered, neither an animal scent nor a common chemical smell. We split into smaller groups to cover more ground. My partner and I followed a makeshift trail into a cluster of trees. Everything was eerily silent. Even the birds seemed to avoid that area. We edged forward, stepping over broken branches, scanning the dirt for more tracks. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. Then I heard it, this low, resonant hum. It vibrated right in my chest, as if the air itself was trembling. It wasn't a growl or a typical animal call. It sounded wrong, like it came from something that didn't belong in that forest. We turned off our flashlights for a moment, trying to let our eyes adjust to the dim light. That's when I saw movement between two massive tree trunks. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and thin. The shape leaned forward, almost stretching, then slipped behind the trees before I could get a proper look. But in that brief glimpse, I caught the reflection of what might have been eyes. The color was hard to describe. Maybe a faint yellow, or maybe it was a trick of the light. A jolt of adrenaline shot through me. I gestured for my partner to stay quiet, and we tried to circle around to get another view. But by the time we got to the spot, there was nothing except fresh claw marks gouged into the bark. Those scratches were long and deep, carved with an unsettling precision. My heart was pounding so hard that I felt it pulsing in my temples. A metallic taste filled my mouth. I was that rattled. We started retracing our steps to regroup with the rest of the team. The forest felt denser somehow, like the air had thickened. Every now and then, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, but I could never focus on anything. Branches snapped in the distance, leaves rustled, but whenever I spun around, there was just empty space. That hum persisted in the background, fading in and out, keeping my nerves on edge. When we finally reunited with the rest, they'd had their own strange encounters, unexplainable noises and silhouettes darting just beyond the trees. No one wanted to linger out there any longer than necessary. We moved back toward the warehouse, keeping our formation tight. With nightfall approaching, the temperature dropped sharply, and that heightened everything else: my senses, my anxiety, my feeling of being watched. Somewhere between the forest's edge and the warehouse, that hum returned, louder than before. It had a vibrating quality that set my teeth on edge. We pointed our flashlights frantically in every direction, and then, for a split second, I saw the outline of something impossibly tall weaving between the trees. The angle of its limbs seemed unnatural, almost disjointed. I tried to call out to my team, but my voice caught in my throat. The next moment, it was gone. The hum died down, leaving only my racing heartbeat in my ears. We stood there, waiting, scanning, but there was nothing to see except the stillness. After a tense minute, we made our way back, not sure if we were being followed or if we had imagined half of what we witnessed. But the footprints, the odors, and those claw marks were real. We took photos, gathered samples, and secured the area as best we could. By the time night fully set in, everything had gone unnervingly quiet. No more hum, no more odd movements. It was like whatever had been watching us decided to vanish into the darkness. I felt this immense relief mixed with lingering dread, like we were safe for the moment, but we hadn't solved anything. We called in to report what we had and were told to stay put until further notice. For a while, we just stood there in the cold night air, confused and on high alert. Eventually, we packed up and left the site, having little choice but to follow the instructions we'd been given. We were ordered not to share any explicit details outside official channels. Part of me was almost grateful, because I knew no one would fully believe the truth. It sounded too bizarre to be real, and yet it happened. That night ended with more questions than answers. We never got a clear explanation of what we encountered or how those footprints came to be. All we had were bits of evidence and terrifying memories. Even now, every time I think back on that day, I get a chill down my spine. I have no idea if that thing is still roaming around Truth Falls, hidden in some corner of those remote woods, waiting for another unsuspecting team to cross its path. For all I know, it could still be out there, keeping its distance until the next time curiosity drives people like us too far into the unknown. And that's the part that scares me most, that I'll never truly be certain if what I saw was some escaped experiment, a freak of nature, or something else entirely. All I know is that I can't forget it, and I don't think I ever will. Story 12. I remember that day in Lakewood Edge like it happened yesterday. I'd gone there in 2015, hoping the fresh air and quiet of that little Minnesota town would help me unwind from the stress of my old job. I'd worked in an intense Native American task force, constantly on edge, so I wanted to spend time in the woods, do some hiking, and clear my thoughts. The locals were friendly enough, though they always hinted at rumors of something strange roaming the forests. At first, I thought it was just folklore or the usual small-town legends. I never imagined I'd experience anything that would make me question my own senses. Early that morning, I woke up in the small cabin I had rented near one of the trails. The sun was barely creeping through the curtains when I left. The plan was to do a long hike, take some photos, and maybe spot some wildlife. The forest seemed alive with the morning light, birds chirping, leaves rustling in a soft breeze. I felt at peace, as if the stress of my old life was finally lifting. By midday, I took a break to eat a sandwich near a creek. Everything was calm and smelled like pine and damp earth. It struck me how quiet it was, even with the soft sounds of water flowing and squirrels scampering around. I felt this odd sense of being watched, but I couldn't see anyone else on the trail. It's the kind of feeling you brush off, telling yourself you're just overthinking. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder more than usual. After lunch, I decided to follow a lesser-known path further into the woods. It was one of those trails locals don't usually recommend, supposedly because it's easy to get lost. The canopy was dense, and the deeper I went, the darker it felt, even though it was still midday. Gradually, I noticed the usual forest sounds fading out. No birds, no wind, no insects. It was eerily silent, like the entire place was holding its breath. My chest tightened, and I remember feeling a chill run up my spine, even though it was fairly warm. Eventually, I stumbled across footprints near a patch of muddy ground. At first glance, they looked like oversized animal tracks, but the edges seemed almost shoe-like in places, like something between a paw and a boot. That combination made no sense to me. I crouched down to get a closer look, and the size of them compared to my own boot print was staggering. They were huge, maybe twice the width of my foot and longer as well. The shape was distorted, like whatever had left them wasn't walking completely upright or was limping. I took pictures with my phone. Honestly, I felt a rush of excitement. Maybe I'd discovered some new species, or just an odd track made by overlapping footprints from different animals. But then I noticed a few more prints leading further down the trail, and something about them made my skin crawl. There was a space between them that suggested a long stride, almost unnatural in length. I got this overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't follow them, like I was crossing into territory that wasn't meant to be disturbed. Still, curiosity won out. I followed the prints deeper until they disappeared into thicker brush. That's when I heard it, the shriek. It was high-pitched, almost like metal scraping on metal, echoing through the trees. My heart nearly stopped. I've heard all sorts of wildlife calls, but this was different. It sounded like it came from everywhere at once, bouncing off the trees and making it impossible to pinpoint a direction. I could feel my heart pounding as I forced myself to keep calm. I checked my surroundings, searching for any movement or sign of an animal. Nothing. Then I heard another noise, like heavy breathing or something shifting in the undergrowth to my left. I froze and waited, struggling to keep my breathing quiet. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and leave, but my legs felt cemented in place. It was as if the forest itself wanted me gone but kept me rooted, unable to move. After what felt like a lifetime, probably only a few seconds, I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the thick brush. The silence came back, almost heavier this time, and I realized I was shaking all over. I remember fumbling for my phone, intending to call my friend who worked as a local forest ranger. My hands were unsteady, and I accidentally took another random photo of the trees before I managed to call him. I told him what had happened and asked him to meet me near the trail entrance. He agreed, sounding as uneasy as I felt. I practically power-walked back, looking over my shoulder every few steps. Even though I didn't see anything, I could feel eyes on me. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a branch swaying or a shadow darting out of view. By the time I reached the trailhead, my shirt was soaked in sweat, and my heart was still racing. My friend showed up, took a quick look at my photos, and suggested we head back in for a closer look, though I could tell he was as spooked as I was. Against my better judgment, I followed him. We retraced my steps, but everything seemed normal, aside from a faint odor in the air that smelled vaguely like rotten eggs mixed with wet fur. We found a few more of those strange footprints, but they were half erased by the soft ground and leaves. The tracks led us in circles, or at least it felt that way. We never heard the shriek again, but I kept catching glimpses of something dark moving between the trees. Whenever we tried to approach, it was just gone. Eventually, we agreed we should report this, though we both knew the local authorities might brush it off as just a large bear or a local rumor. Still, we left the area and headed straight to the municipal office. As expected, we got a polite shrug and a vague reassurance that they'd look into it. I could tell nobody wanted to dig deeper, almost like they'd heard versions of this story before and chose to ignore them. They put up a few extra warning signs and basically told us not to roam around at dusk. That evening, I found myself alone again in my cabin, the encounter replaying in my mind. I couldn't shake the memory of that distorted footprint and that horrifying shriek. I felt like I was stuck in a fog of adrenaline, still keyed up, expecting something to claw at my door in the middle of the night. But nothing happened. The next day was quiet, and the day after that, just normal small-town life. It was as if the woods went back to pretending nothing unusual lurked inside. I ended up leaving Lakewood Edge not too long after. My plan had always been to stay for a few months, but that experience fast-tracked my decision. To this day, I can't explain what made those tracks or what let out that bone-chilling cry. Every time I think about it, I get the same knots in my stomach I did when I first heard it. It felt like the forest was warning me, telling me I was an unwelcome guest in a place that kept its secrets hidden under thick canopy and silent trails. I haven't talked about this much, mostly because I know how people react. They'll say it was a bear, a trick of the wind, or that I was just jumpy from my old job. But I know what I felt out there, and no matter how I try to rationalize it, I can't shake the certainty that there's something in those woods that defies any simple explanation. I've come to accept that sometimes you just can't chase every mystery because you might not like what you find. Even now, years later, I'll occasionally look at those photos. The footprints, the eerie trees, it all comes rushing back. And each time, I feel that same prickly fear on my neck. Nothing quite adds up, and no one has ever given me a clear answer. Part of me wonders if I should have stayed longer, tried to gather more evidence, but deep down, I'm relieved I left. Whatever was out there, it let me walk away, like it decided to vanish as quickly as it appeared. And that's exactly how I remember Lakewood Edge, a place where mysteries slip between the trees, appear just long enough to leave a scar on your mind, and then fade away without explanation. Story 13. I remember that spring day in 2016 like it was yesterday. I had just settled into my new post at Willow Peak, Wyoming, my latest assignment as a fire lookout. I've done plenty of stints in remote towers before, so I wasn't exactly expecting any surprises. But that day, everything felt off. When I woke up, the morning seemed normal enough. I did my usual checks, scanning the valley for any hint of smoke, verifying the radio, and making sure I had enough firewood stacked by the tower. Right after lunch, I decided to head out for a quick walk around the tower's perimeter to stretch my legs. That's when I noticed these enormous footprints. They weren't bear tracks. Bears have a distinct shape, and I've seen those plenty of times. These prints were strangely spaced, like something with a long stride had passed through. At first, I figured maybe someone had wandered off the main trails, but no one was supposed to be this deep in the forest without a permit, and besides, the spacing of these footprints was just bizarre. I tried to follow them, but they disappeared on a patch of rocky terrain. I shrugged it off, told myself it was probably nothing, and moved on with my day. Still, my gut wouldn't settle down. The entire area felt quieter than usual, like the birds and squirrels had gone silent at the exact same time. Usually, you hear little rustling sounds or see the occasional chipmunk dart across a log, but not that day. I remember scanning the treetops, thinking maybe a storm was brewing, and the animals sensed it first. The sky did look a bit grey, so I chalked it up to a change in weather. By mid-afternoon, I got a radio call from Doris, who was stationed at another lookout a few miles away. She mentioned she'd noticed the forest seemed oddly silent too. Doris has always been a no-nonsense type, so if she said something felt strange, I believed her. We chatted briefly about possible reasons, but we were both sort of stumped. We agreed to keep each other posted if anything else happened. The day dragged on with that uneasy vibe hanging in the air. I tried to concentrate on my routine tasks, checking weather patterns and logging them, scanning the horizon for unusual smoke or color changes in the canopy. But my eyes kept drifting back to where I'd seen those footprints earlier. Around late afternoon, I thought I saw movement between the pines. It was just a glimpse of something dark and tall, slipping behind the trunks. I grabbed my binoculars but saw nothing. It could have been a deer or a tall shadow cast by the setting sun. Still, it made the hairs on my neck stand up. As the sun began to set, a thick silence settled over the trees. It wasn't just normal evening calm. This felt deeper, almost suffocating. I was at the base of my tower, about to climb back up, when I heard this low, drawn-out whistling noise echo through the woods. It wasn't a bird call, and it definitely wasn't the wind. It sounded like a mix between a person whistling and some kind of distant horn. My heart jumped. I spun around with my flashlight, trying to locate the source. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe there was a stranger out here, lost or trying to scare me. But I saw nothing, no movement, no silhouette. I rushed into the tower, locked the door, and kept the flashlight pointed out through the windows. Every few minutes, that eerie whistle would start up again, always from a different direction, like something was circling. I tried to steady my breathing, but it felt like the entire forest was pressing in on me. I got on the radio to Doris, told her what was happening. She sounded just as uneasy. She said she hadn't heard the whistle, but had this overwhelming feeling of being watched. She suggested calling in a patrol just to be safe. I spent the rest of that evening with my radio at my side, pacing around the tower's platform and shining my light onto the surrounding trees. Each time the whistling started, it felt closer, but I could never see anything out there. I started sweating, even though it was getting chilly. My mind jumped to all sorts of worst-case scenarios, a wounded animal, a person messing with me, or something else I didn't want to name. More than once, I thought about climbing down and trying to confront whatever was out there. But fear got the best of me. I had no desire to wander into the dark woods, chasing some unknown thing. Sometime around midnight, the whistling just stopped. It was like someone flipped a switch. I didn't hear a single sound after that, not even the usual crickets. I was relieved, but at the same time it felt too sudden. I forced myself to stay awake a while longer, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing but stillness. Eventually, I dozed off in my chair, flashlight in hand, the radio next to me. When dawn broke, I felt this rush of relief. Somehow, daylight made me feel safer. I climbed down the tower to check the area around the base. That's when I noticed fresh marks on the soil, almost like something or someone had paced in circles. It wasn't exactly footprints this time, more like gouges in the dirt. But they formed a strange pattern that looped around the tower. I can't even describe it properly, just that it didn't seem natural, like an animal simply sniffing around. I reported everything to the park authorities, and a small team came out to inspect. They found the same weird marks, but we couldn't figure out what had made them. There were no claw marks, no definitive tracks that matched any wildlife in the area. The patrol spent a few hours combing through the nearby woods and found nothing unusual except that unnatural quiet. By the time they left, even they seemed spooked, though no one outright admitted it. That evening, the forest started to get back to its regular rhythm, birds chirping, branches creaking. Doris radioed me and said the animals seemed more active again, as if whatever had kept them silent had moved on. Neither of us really had a solid explanation. Part of me wanted to believe it was all a series of coincidences, a change in weather patterns, maybe a rogue elk wandering around. But deep down, I knew something else had been out there. After that day, I made sure to keep my eyes and ears open whenever I was out gathering wood or doing my rounds. The weirdness never happened again in such an intense way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest held something I couldn't understand. I remember walking the perimeter, getting that same prickle on the back of my neck whenever I passed the spot where I saw those footprints. I'd linger, hoping to see something that would explain it all, but nothing ever did. And that's basically it. That freaky day still sits in my memory like a bad dream. I've had plenty of nights alone in different forests, but Willow Peak remains the only place where I genuinely felt watched. The whistling, the vanishing silhouette, the strange prints, I can't explain any of it even now. Sometimes I try convincing myself it was a trick of the wind or some harmless wanderer pulling a prank. But it never quite adds up. All I know is that after the sun rose, the danger seemed to vanish as abruptly as it began, leaving me with nothing but questions. I've since moved on to other fire lookout posts, yet that spring in Wyoming still has a hold on me. I keep thinking that if I ever go back, I might hear that whistle again, echoing through the pines, or catch a glimpse of something tall and dark slipping between the trunks. I don't know what it was, but I know for sure it changed the way I look at the silent spaces in a forest. It reminded me that silence doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes it's the sound of something watching you, just out of sight. Story 14. I remember that day in 2017 like it was yesterday. I'd been working at Hampton Ridge National Park in Arizona for a few weeks as a temporary guard, and I thought I'd seen enough deserts, canyons, and caves in my life to handle whatever popped up. My name is Jasper Zielinski, and back then I felt pretty confident about my skills. But nothing prepared me for that afternoon and the following night, when things got truly bizarre. It started in the late afternoon while I was doing a routine check near an area called Falcon Cliff. There's a small hidden cave entrance there that rarely gets visited. The sun was hitting the rocks at such an angle that the canyon walls looked almost unreal, like they were glowing from the inside. Normally, I'd take a moment to appreciate the scenery, but that day I felt on edge. Maybe it was the quiet, quieter than usual, if that makes sense. It was like the entire place was holding its breath. As I moved closer to the cave entrance, I noticed these weird triangular markings in the sand. They looked too large to be footprints from any regular animal out here, and too perfect to be random shapes caused by the wind. I crouched down to get a closer look. The prints weren't deep, but they were very distinct, like someone had taken a tool and pressed it into the sand 3 times, creating a shape kind of like a 3-pointed star. I took some pictures with my phone, figuring I'd show them to the supervisor later. A gnawing feeling in my gut told me to keep going, so I decided to check inside the cave. I'd never been in that specific cave before, so I used my flashlight. The entrance was narrow, and the deeper I went, the colder it seemed to get. After about a minute, I noticed what looked like scratches on the cave walls. Long, shallow lines that curved strangely, almost like runes. They didn't look like typical animal claw marks. It gave me chills. I'm not gonna lie. Part of me wanted to turn around right then. But I kept pushing in a bit further, and that's when I heard a faint shuffling sound. It echoed, so I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It stopped for a moment, and my flashlight started flickering, which made the shadows dance on the walls. I got the sudden feeling that something was breathing just out of sight. I called out, "Hello?" instinctively, even though I knew that was a dumb move. The echo came back hollow, and then the silence returned. Out of nowhere I heard this odd scraping noise, like claws, or maybe something metallic, dragging across rock. My heart started racing. I tried to adjust my flashlight, hoping the batteries weren't dying. The beam lit up a deeper part of the cave, and for a fraction of a second I saw what looked like two faint glowing eyes reflecting back at me. They were too low to the ground to be a person's eyes, yet too high to belong to something like a coyote. Then they disappeared in a blink, and I was left standing there, sweating in the cool air. I backed out of the cave slowly, not wanting to make any sudden moves. Once I was back outside, the daylight felt jarringly bright. I scanned the area around me, but everything was still. No footprints, no dust kicked up, nothing. The triangular marks in the sand were still there, though, which at least confirmed I wasn't imagining things. It was getting close to sunset, so I reported in by radio and told the supervisor I'd found some weird markings and possible evidence of I didn't even know what. He told me to keep my eyes open but avoid going in alone again until we could get more staff. That's typical protocol, but deep down, I was already thinking no one else would believe me unless they saw it for themselves. I felt a mixture of dread and curiosity, so instead of heading back to base, I decided to stick around the area. Part of me was hoping to spot whatever made those prints, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. As night fell, the desert temperature dropped fast. I was wearing my standard ranger jacket, but I could still feel a chill crawling up my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. The moon was bright enough to see the outlines of the canyon walls, and I kept scanning the area with my flashlight. Everything was quiet, so quiet that when a breeze finally stirred and rustled the brush, it actually made me jump. I sat near a rock outcropping, watching the cave entrance from a distance. I don't know how long I waited, maybe an hour, when I noticed something moving. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the moonlight, but then I saw a dark shape flicker near the cave's edge. It was fast. It almost seemed to glide rather than walk. The shape paused, and I swear it turned in my direction. My heart hammered so loudly I could hear my pulse in my ears. I aimed my flashlight, but by the time I did, the shape was gone. I got up, trying to keep calm, and walked to the spot where I'd seen it. There, on the ground, were more triangular imprints. Some were half-formed, like something heavy but odd-shaped had put pressure on the sand. My flashlight started acting up again, flickering just enough to drive me crazy. I heard what sounded like raspy breathing behind me, and I spun around, shining the beam everywhere. Nothing. Just darkness and the echo of my own steps. I decided I'd had enough. My gut was screaming for me to leave. But as I made my way back, the weirdest thing happened. The desert started humming. It was so low I almost didn't notice it at first, but the vibrations felt like they were under my feet, in the ground. The hum built slowly, like a distant engine, but with an unnatural tone I can't even properly describe. Then, just as I was about to radio in for help, it stopped dead. total silence again. I rushed back toward the main path, and suddenly a sharp cry, almost like a wounded animal, echoed from somewhere behind me. My blood turned to ice. I didn't even look back. I just forced my legs to move as quickly as possible. When I reached the ranger station, I was out of breath and drenched in sweat. I told one of the other guards what happened, and we both went back to check, armed with better flashlights and an extra radio. But when we arrived, everything was completely still. No footprints, no markings, no sign of the disturbance. It was like the desert had wiped itself clean. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us, maybe mocking our attempt to make sense of it. We did a thorough scan of the area. Nothing, not even those triangular impressions in the sand. It was like they'd never existed. By the time we gave up and went back, dawn was breaking, painting the sky in pale oranges and pinks. It looked so peaceful that I almost doubted what I'd seen. I finished my shift soon after. That was actually my last official day at Hampton Ridge. I was scheduled to pack up and leave the following morning. To this day, I can't explain what I experienced out there near Falcon Cliff. The photographs I'd taken of the triangular shapes were blurry at best, and no one could identify them. I still question if my eyes might have been playing tricks on me, but I know what I heard. I know what I felt. What really haunts me is how abruptly everything stopped. One moment, I was facing those strange footprints, seeing glimpses of something in the dark, and hearing that eerie hum. Then suddenly, it all vanished, like it never even happened. Sometimes I think that's the scariest part. The possibility that something beyond our understanding can appear and disappear without warning, leaving us with more questions than answers. I haven't been back to Hampton Ridge since, but not a day goes by that I don't remember those silent caves and that unsettling presence. Even now, whenever I think about it, I get a tight knot in my stomach, like whatever I felt that night still has its eyes on me somehow. I have no proof, no solid evidence, just the memory of those triangular prints in the sand and the echo of that awful scraping noise in the darkness, and that's enough to make my skin crawl every single time. Story 15. My name is Ezekiel Hawthorne, and back in 2018, I hit a wall with my job and felt I had to escape somewhere quiet. I chose a small place in northern Colorado called Shadow Creek, hoping I could clear my head amid the tall mountains and crisp air. My friend, Peral O'Sullivan, joined me in this plan with an old trailer we borrowed. We parked near a valley surrounded by incredible peaks, thinking a few days of hiking and soaking in the scenery would reset our minds. Right off the bat, the air felt different there. Crisp, yes, but also strangely heavy. The first day went by normally enough. We found a decent spot to park the trailer, took a short walk near a winding stream, and then settled in for the evening. It was the kind of place where you could hear your own breathing because everything else was so still. On the second night, things got weird. We were lying in our sleeping bags, not quite asleep, when I started hearing these soft footsteps just outside. They were slow and paused every few seconds, like someone stopping to listen. Then I swore I heard whispers, too faint to make out words. I thought maybe I was half dreaming until I felt Peril shift beside me. He had heard it too. It wasn't just me. I decided to peek out of the small window. That's when I spotted this figure, right up against a tree not far from our trailer. I couldn't see many details, just a tall shape hunched slightly, facing our direction. My heart started thudding in my chest, and Peral looked at me with that expression that says, "What the hell is that?" We tried turning on the outside lights, hoping the glare would scare it off. But the figure just stood there, motionless, as if the light didn't bother it at all. We called out, thinking maybe it was a hiker or camper who needed help. But it didn't answer, didn't move. After a few minutes of mounting tension, we locked the trailer door and tried to calm down, figuring we'd deal with it in the morning. Honestly, I half expected to hear scratching at the door or see some face pressed against the window, but all we got was silence after a while. Eventually, we drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, there was no trace of anyone. Peril and I looked around for footprints or broken branches, anything that might prove we really saw someone. But the ground was mostly hard-packed earth and scattered pine needles. We found nothing. That morning, we headed to the nearest park visitor center. The staff there shrugged it off, saying maybe it was a passerby who got lost, or someone from a nearby campsite playing a prank. They didn't seem alarmed, so we tried to let it go. For the next couple of afternoons, we took advantage of the gorgeous surroundings. We hiked paths, flanked by golden aspen trees and rocky slopes that glowed in the late afternoon sun. But there was always that uneasy feeling like we were being watched. I caught myself turning around at random intervals, scanning the edges of the forest. Peril noticed it too. We kept telling ourselves we were just on edge because of that weird nighttime encounter. One afternoon, we stumbled upon a cabin tucked away off a side trail. It was small, the wood looked aged, and I don't remember seeing any signage about private property. It wasn't on the map we had. We walked around it, peering through a dusty window and spotting old furniture, a couple of broken chairs, and what looked like a rusted lantern. Everything seemed untouched for ages. We tried the door, but it was locked. The place gave me an odd vibe, like someone had left in a hurry a long time ago. We decided to keep moving, chalking it up to an old homestead or an abandoned outpost. The fourth night, the uneasy vibe escalated. Just after midnight, we heard distinct footsteps again. This time, they came closer to the trailer, and we even felt a faint tapping on the metal wall. It wasn't a harsh knock, more like a dragging touch, as if someone was slowly running their hand along the outside. My stomach twisted into a knot. Peril grabbed his flashlight, but stepping outside in the dark just felt like the worst idea possible. We checked our phones for a signal. Nothing. We were too far from any tower. We stayed inside, hearts pounding, as the scraping sound circled around, then vanished into the night. It left us both with this deep sense of dread, like we were intruding on something. I remember sitting there, not even wanting to breathe too loudly, just waiting for the next horrifying sound. Eventually, the silence took over again, but I barely slept. My imagination kept conjuring thoughts of someone peering through the windows, or that tall figure waiting right outside for us to step out. When the sun came up, we decided we'd had enough. We started packing up, looking over our shoulders the whole time. While Peral was collapsing the tarp, he called me over to show me these bizarre footprints in the dirt. They were too long and narrow to be normal human footprints, and they wrapped around our trailer in a looping pattern. It was like something had paced in circles during the night. I tried lining my own boot next to one, and it was at least half a size larger than any shoe I'd ever seen, but unbelievably narrow. It sent a chill down my spine, just seeing them in broad daylight. We got hold of a park ranger who came by to take a look. He didn't have much to offer. He suggested maybe they were from a strange pair of boots, or maybe we were looking at distorted prints from wet dirt. But it hadn't rained, and the earth was fairly dry, so that explanation felt off. He didn't seem worried, though, just kind of confused. With no real evidence of a crime or anything, there wasn't much for him to do. We drove out of Shadow Creek that same day, both of us silent for the first hour on the road. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been observed by something that didn't want us there. Even now, years later, I still can't explain what happened or why. Peril and I talk about it sometimes, wondering if it was just some strange local messing with us, or if there's an actual occupant of that old cabin who wanders around at night. We never figured it out, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that those nights in Shadow Creek felt darker than any place I'd ever been. That image of the silent figure in the tree line and the slow dragging on the trailer still unsettles me. We went there for peace, and instead we got this unsettling reminder that the most beautiful places can have a hidden edge to them. Sometimes, no matter how much you want to relax and forget life's stresses, something else out there has other plans. To this day, I can't explain who was walking around our trailer or why those footprints looked the way they did. Nothing else like that has happened to me since, but the memory still creeps into my mind on quiet nights. And every time I think of returning to Shadow Creek, I feel a chill that makes me hesitate. I guess there are places where the peace isn't what it seems, and some mysteries are just meant to stay unsolved. Story 16. My name is Reyes Carver, and back in 2019, I was assigned to a reconnaissance mission near Crescent Heights, a small town in South Dakota. I remember that day so vividly. It was supposed to be a standard check for unusual activity, but it ended up being anything but routine. The place itself gave me an odd feeling as soon as I arrived. Narrow roads, a few old wooden houses, and a population that seemed a little too quiet. I'd been told about strange sightings and odd noises in the outskirts, but I figured it might just be exaggerated rumors. Early that morning, my team and I drove out toward a set of distant farms on the edge of the county. We talked to the local sheriff first, who mentioned weird footprints and sightings of a tall figure roaming around at night. We wanted to collect any evidence we could and then get out of there. The plan was simple: check a couple of farms, note any possible damage, talk to the owners, then investigate a run-down galpon someone had complained about. I expected maybe a coyote problem or some local teenager playing pranks. It didn't take long to see that something was off. The first farm had fences that looked like something heavy had pushed through them, not torn up in a normal way, more like bent at odd angles. When we tried to ask the older man who owned the place what had happened, he got this faraway look in his eyes and mumbled about a huge silhouette in the darkness. He cut himself short, as if he didn't want to sound crazy in front of strangers. I went around the fence line and noticed strange marks in the dirt, long impressions that definitely weren't just boot prints. They were too broad, too elongated. My partner took a few photos and we moved on. I tried to stay cool, but something about how quiet those fields were, with broken fence posts and that uneasy old man, kept me on edge. By late afternoon, we had made our way to the old galpon we'd heard about. It sat behind some overgrown bushes and looked like it hadn't been used in years. Rusted metal siding, a sagging roof, and a single door hanging on by a thread. It felt weird just standing outside because this place had a strange air to it, like stale dust and something else I couldn't put my finger on. And then that smell hit me. It wasn't manure or decay exactly, but it had a sickly metallic tang that made my stomach churn. We stepped inside carefully, flashlights on, scanning the area. Everything was coated in a layer of dirt and spiderwebs. There were old tools on the ground, broken crates, and a few tire tracks that led nowhere. My heart was pounding because the atmosphere inside felt heavier than it should have, almost as if we'd intruded on something we weren't supposed to see. At one point, while I was poking around a corner, I heard a metallic clang echo from behind a stack of crates. It was loud enough to make me jump. I ran toward the sound, flashlight shaking in my grip, but there was no one there. I signaled to the rest of my team, and we spread out to check every nook and cranny. Nothing. No footprints, no fresh tracks, nothing that explained that noise. But again, that odor was in the air, stronger now, making me feel nauseous. The sun started setting, and we decided to keep watch for a while, hoping to catch whoever or whatever had been causing trouble. We parked our vehicles nearby and set up a quick perimeter around the galpon. I was on edge, wishing I could just wrap up the mission, but also feeling that if we left now, we'd miss the chance to figure out what was really going on. Around midnight, the temperature dropped fast. Clouds rolled in, hiding the moonlight, and everything became pitch black. We switched on our night vision gear and tried to keep watch in rotating shifts. Around that time, I began hearing this faint dragging sound from outside, like something scraping against the dirt. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, scanning the area. My heart was pounding in my ears. Some part of me was expecting to see some massive shape lurking, but all I caught were fleeting shadows against the dim headlights. Suddenly, I noticed movement by the side of the galpon. I got that cold, electrifying wave of fear that shoots up your spine. It was just a silhouette, but it was tall, way taller than anyone on my team. It hunched slightly, then seemed to slip behind the building in one fluid motion, almost too smooth to be human. I took a few steps closer, adrenaline racing, trying to catch another glimpse. By the time I got around the corner, I saw nothing but darkness. I radioed the rest of the team, and we did a quick sweep around the perimeter again. No footprints, no sound, nothing. It was like it vanished into thin air. My team joked nervously, trying to shake off the tension, I guess, but I felt a knot in my stomach. Something wasn't adding up. The footsteps I'd heard, that eerie shape, the damaged fences, the smell. Everything pointed to some presence that was way beyond a simple trespasser. We spent the next hour pacing around the galpon, trying to act like we weren't scared out of our minds. Eventually, I leaned against the side of the building, exhausted, and that's when I heard it. A single metallic thump inside, followed by a dragging noise, like someone pulling a heavy chain across the concrete floor. My pulse sped up as I motioned for the others to follow me in. Inside, the darkness was suffocating. My flashlight flickered for a moment. Bad timing. I had that sense of vulnerability, like I was about to get ambushed at any second. The sound echoed again, coming from a far corner. I swear, in the beam of the flashlight, I caught a glimpse of something large shifting behind a stack of crates. I froze, my heart hammering. One of my teammates was right behind me, quietly muttering under his breath. We moved slowly, beams of light sliding over dusty walls. The air felt thick, suffocating. When we reached that corner, there was absolutely nothing, just some rusted tools, a few crates, and a bunch of dust swirling around. No footprints that matched what we'd seen outside, no big creature hiding in the shadows. But that smell was nearly overpowering, like hot metal and rotting plants mixed together. My eyes even watered for a second. I started to feel dizzy, so we pulled back and regrouped outside. That's when the weirdness reached its peak. I was standing by one of our vehicles, radio in hand, feeling a chill that cut right through me when I heard rapid footsteps circling the galpon. It sounded like someone, or something, running laps around us. We tried to catch sight of it, but it moved faster than our flashlights could track. My teammate and I dashed around opposite sides, hoping to corner whatever was out there. But we kept arriving half a second too late. We'd see a flicker of movement, then gone. No noise, no heavy breathing, just silence. I remember feeling an almost primal fear at that point. I couldn't rationalize what was happening. It felt like we were dealing with something bigger than a person, yet it moved too smoothly to be a wild animal. The rest of the team looked just as unsettled, but we were all too proud or too stubborn to admit we were scared out of our wits. Not long after that, everything just stopped. One moment, we were hearing those footsteps circling us, that scraping noise, and dealing with that awful smell. Then it all went dead quiet. No footsteps, no metallic bangs, nothing. The sudden silence was almost worse, because I had no idea where that thing had gone or what it wanted. We did another search with our flashlights, scanning every inch of that property. Still nothing. By the time the first glow of dawn hit, we decided to call it. We were exhausted, and honestly, we were at a dead end. I'd seen enough to know something truly strange was out there, but I had no solid proof. Just footprints that didn't make sense, a rancid smell, and a few terrifying glimpses of something that shouldn't exist. We loaded up our gear, reported our findings, and headed back to town. That day, I thought I'd be relieved to get away from that galpon. But the ride back left me with this heavy feeling that wouldn't go away. I couldn't shake the thought that we had barely scratched the surface of what was really lurking around Crescent Heights. We officially wrapped up our operation soon after, with nothing conclusive to show except scattered evidence of possible unidentified activity. People in town went on with their lives, and maybe they just chalked up the stories to folklore or superstition. But I knew something else was out there, something that had been watching us. To this day, I can't explain the warped fences, the oversized footprints, that damn smell, or that massive shape that vanished right before my eyes. Part of me wonders if we got off easy by not coming face to face with whatever it was in the darkness. Every now and then, I still think about that night at the galpon, how the noises just stopped, how that figure disappeared like it was never there. I guess some places keep their secrets hidden well, and sometimes you just don't get the closure you want. I know I sure didn't. Story 17. I remember that day in 2020 like it just happened yesterday. My name is Byron Hartley, and I'd been sent out to Pinewood Ranch in the remote stretches of New Mexico to support a small Native American team investigating reports of strange creatures roaming the desert. My job was simple on paper: analyze maps, figure out possible routes for quick evacuation if something went wrong, and basically keep everyone safe from a logistical standpoint. But nothing on paper prepared me for what I experienced that day. The morning started out typical enough. The desert sun was relentless, even before noon. Dust clung to my boots, and that dry, scorching air sapped my energy with every step. I was with two other investigators, both of them far more knowledgeable about the local legends than I was. We split up early in the day. One of them wanted to check out a certain rock formation about a mile from our base, while the other planned to visit an older man in a nearby settlement who might have information about local folklore. I stayed behind at our makeshift camp, which was nothing more than 2 tents, a table stacked with radio equipment, and a couple of coolers stuffed with water. While the others were gone, I spent the time studying some rough sketches of the terrain. I'd been noticing odd markings on boulders near our camp. They looked like deep scratches or carved shapes. Not exactly letters, but they had some consistent pattern, like deliberate symbols scratched by something that understood what it was doing. I tried matching them to the local topography, seeing if maybe they lined up with trails or vantage points. But every time I connected the dots, I'd just confuse myself further. It felt like a puzzle meant to keep me guessing. By mid-afternoon, the heat had become brutal. I found some shade under a rock ledge and rested. That's when I first noticed a faint noise echoing across the desert. At first, I thought it was just the wind kicking up dust. But as I sat there, I realized it was more rhythmic, almost like a whistle or a long, hollow sigh. It would start softly, then fade out, sometimes overlapping with another sigh in a different direction. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Something about that sound just felt off. The other investigators returned around dusk with minimal findings. A few footprints in the desert sand that looked bigger than a human's, and more of those strange scratch markings on some rocks. They confirmed they'd heard a similar whistle-like sound, possibly coming from a gap between 2 big boulders. We ate a quick meal, basically some dried snacks and canned fruit, and decided we'd do a nighttime stakeout. Reports from locals suggested these sightings often happened after sunset, when the air got cold and the desert was quiet. As the sky dimmed, the temperature dropped sharply. I remember shivering while trying to set up a small fire, the wind picking up and making it hard to keep the flames steady. Everything around us felt muted. like the desert itself was holding its breath. No animals scurrying around, no distant calls of coyotes. It was eerily silent, except for that intermittent whistling I'd heard earlier. It seemed closer now, but still impossible to track. Our plan was to keep watch for a few hours, then either split up if we saw or heard something worth investigating, or regroup in the tents if it stayed quiet. But it never stayed quiet for long. At one point, I caught a glimmer of light reflecting off something metallic on a distant ridge. I used my binoculars, but it was too dark to make out any real shape. Just a brief flicker, like someone signaling with a mirror. One of my partners wanted to walk over, but the terrain was tricky in the dark, and we weren't sure if we'd be stumbling into a sinkhole or a canyon. About an hour later, I heard the sharpest whistle yet, followed by a strange thumping noise. It was like two heavy objects smashing together, but muffled. My heart started racing. There was this sudden urge in me to duck down, even though I was just sitting by our campfire. I swear every instinct told me I was being watched. I slowly turned toward the direction of the sound, and the firelight cast my shadow long across the ground. I thought I saw something move behind a cluster of rocks, but it was just out of the fire's glow, so I couldn't be sure. One of the investigators grabbed a flashlight, and we cautiously walked a short distance from camp. I was in charge of holding the radio, just in case. The wind was howling by then, and the flashlight beam bounced all over as my partner tried to steady it. We found footprints, large, oddly spaced, with what seemed like claw marks at the ends of each indent in the dirt. The prints led behind a boulder, then seemed to vanish into nothing. Standing there, I felt an overwhelming sense of being intruded upon, like we were on land we weren't supposed to be on. A deep chill ran up my spine, and I realized it wasn't just the cold desert air. It was fear. Pure, raw fear. Part of me wanted to turn and run back to camp, lock myself inside the truck, and never look back. But I had a job to do, so I forced myself to stay. Suddenly, we heard a rasping noise behind us, almost like a big animal clearing its throat. We spun around, flashlight jittering across the rocks. There was nothing there, yet I could feel something. I remember my hands shaking so bad that the radio nearly slipped from my grip. My partner whispered that we should fall back. I couldn't agree more. We hurried back to the tents and found the other team member pacing nervously by the dwindling campfire. They'd heard it too, the weird rasp, the whistle, and something like heavy breathing. The three of us decided to keep the fire going and stay put, hoping that if something was out there, the light might deter it. We huddled closer, barely speaking above a whisper. Every noise in the dark felt magnified. Small pebbles rolling, wind brushing against the tent flaps, the crackling of burning wood. Then, at the edge of the flickering light, I saw a shape. Tall, impossibly lanky. I can't describe it clearly because it was more like a silhouette than a solid figure. It just stood there, still as a statue. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it would hear us. I mustered the courage to swing the flashlight in its direction, and in that split second, I swear I saw an outline of something not quite human, like it had elongated limbs and a pale, rough texture, but the beam of light reflected off nothing but rock. The shape was gone. We spent the next hour combing through the area with flashlights and the small lantern we had, but found no footprints, no tracks, just the same weird scratch marks and the endless desert. It felt like a game of cat and mouse, except we had no idea which side we were on. Right around midnight, everything just stopped. The wind died, the whistling ceased, and the desert turned dead silent again. It was as if someone had flipped a switch and ended whatever was toying with us. We were too shaken to sleep, so we stayed by the fire, half expecting that shape to appear again. But it never did. By the early morning hours, we realized that we had nothing concrete to show for our terror. No photos, No solid evidence, just the echo of that unearthly whistle in our ears and the memory of that horrifying silhouette. I remember looking at the horizon, waiting for the first rays of sunlight, feeling both relieved that we'd made it through the night and strangely disappointed that we hadn't uncovered the truth. After sunrise, we packed up and headed back to the small settlement where the elder was. He asked us no questions and offered no explanations, just gave us a knowing look that sent a chill through me. It was like he already understood what we'd encountered. No one else in the area seemed surprised by our story, but no one would confirm or deny anything either. We left Pinewood Ranch shortly after, each of us carrying more questions than answers. To this day, I can't explain what we witnessed, or why it seemed so intent on letting us catch mere glimpses of it. All I know is that for one long, terrifying night, I felt like I'd wandered into a place where the lines between our world and something older, stranger, were blurred. Sometimes I still hear that whistle in my dreams, and I wake up covered in sweat, remembering that tall, silent figure standing at the edge of the firelight. And I have no idea if it's still out there, hiding among the rocks and the dusty canyons. But if anyone else decides to venture into Pinewood Ranch looking for answers, I can only hope they're ready for whatever may be waiting in the dark. I sure wasn't. Story 18. I still remember how uneasy I felt the moment we got that call. It was late in the afternoon, and our dispatcher told us about a group of hikers on the Black Ridge Trail who reported seeing something moving near an old abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The words they used, a tall figure and unnatural movements, were vague but unsettling. Normally, these calls turn out to be nothing more than overactive imaginations. But that day felt different from the start. My name is Leon Edwards, and in 2021, I was part of a search and rescue team in Colorado. We didn't have much daylight left, so our team hurried out. The drive to Black Ridge wasn't too long, but it's remote enough that it feels like another world. The wind was blowing in these irregular bursts, rattling the branches in a way I wasn't used to. It gave me the sense something was off, almost like the forest itself was nervous. When we arrived at the trailhead, we quickly found the hikers who had called us. They were clearly rattled, saying they'd seen a towering shape that moved too smoothly for a human. They tried to get a better look, but the figure slid away with a strange grace that made no sound except for faint, rustling leaves. They could only describe it as taller than any normal person. They called for help because after that sighting, they started hearing soft footsteps around them, as if it was circling their camp. Their fear was so genuine, it was hard not to be concerned. Our group split into two teams. The first team headed along the main path, while my partner and I took a side route toward the old cabin. We wanted to check if anyone was hiding out there. Sometimes people squat in these forgotten places. The cabin itself was easy to spot. Even from a distance, you could see it was barely standing. The roof sagged. One of the walls looked like it had been patched with rotting planks, and the surrounding area was a tangle of undergrowth. We approached carefully, scanning for footprints or any sign of human activity. To our surprise, we did see what looked like fresh tracks in the dirt around the cabin. They weren't especially large, but the spacing seemed odd, almost as if whoever made them was stepping with exaggerated strides. I felt my heart rate climb as we followed the footprints around the side of the building. Inside, the cabin was worse than I expected. Dusty, rotted floorboards, scattered junk. Still, there were old utensils and a half-broken table, like someone had once tried to use it. A few footprints led into corners and then disappeared. We used our flashlights to peek through every gap, but all we found were spiderwebs, leaves, and decaying wood. No signs of recent living arrangements, yet outside we'd clearly seen footprints. That contradiction made me uneasy. As the sun sank lower, we decided to stick around a bit longer to see if anything or anyone returned. My partner and I radioed the other team, who hadn't found anything abnormal on the main trail. They told us the hikers were safe and would be escorted down soon. That left me and my partner at the cabin in the fading light, waiting for whatever might be skulking in the woods. Once dusk turned to night, the place got eerily silent. There was barely any wind now, just occasional gusts that made the nearby pines shiver. That's when we started hearing light snapping sounds. It's typical for forests to have little twigs breaking here or there, animals moving around. But these snaps had a deliberate rhythm, like footsteps on broken twigs. They seemed to circle the cabin slowly, but when we shined our flashlights out the broken windows, we couldn't see anyone. I tried convincing myself it was just a deer, or maybe the wind knocking branches down, but in my gut, I knew it was something else. After a few minutes of that creeping noise, I caught movement through one of the side windows. I flicked my light in that direction and spotted a tall silhouette between the trees. It must have been at least a head taller than me, standing impossibly straight. The shape seemed to be watching us. There was this sense that it knew we were there, and it was sizing us up. Before I could really focus on it, the thing darted away with this fluid speed that sent a surge of adrenaline through me. I'd seen people run in the dark, but never that quickly or that smoothly. My partner and I hurried outside, scanning the tree line, but it was pointless. All we heard was a faint rustle of branches, and then nothing. We circled the cabin, shining our flashlights in every direction. No other footprints, no sign of someone fleeing. Just the wind picking up again, making the trees sway ominously. We stood there, trying to catch any further sounds, but it was completely still. We radioed the other team about what we'd just seen, but they had nothing to report. No sign of anyone unusual, no footprints on their side. They asked if we needed backup, but we had zero evidence of a real threat. Just glimpses and weird noises, not enough to justify a larger search operation at night. Reluctantly, we decided to call it. Nothing indicated immediate danger, and we couldn't chase a shadow all night. Still, I felt tense as we loaded up our gear. Something about the silence in those woods just felt wrong. Usually by that time you'd hear owls or small animals scurrying, but it was dead quiet. As we left, I kept looking back at the tree line, half expecting to see that tall figure again, watching. But all I saw were the silhouettes of pines and the stars overhead. We regrouped with the others at the trail entrance. The hikers looked relieved we didn't find any real danger, but also disappointed we didn't solve the mystery. We gave them the usual advice. If they hear anything else or see anyone suspicious, contact the authorities again. On the drive back, none of us talked much. It was like we collectively felt we'd encountered something we couldn't explain, and we had no answers. I've been part of search and rescue for years, and I've seen all kinds of weird things in the wilderness. Strange animals, odd footprints, even people living off-grid. But I've never felt so unsettled by what I couldn't see clearly. I can't explain why a figure would be that tall, or how it moved so fast without making a single loud noise. Maybe it was just a person messing around, maybe not. It's hard to say for sure. Even now, I still get a jolt of anxiety when I remember how smoothly that thing disappeared into the darkness. We never found any leads after that, and no one reported seeing it again. For all I know, it's still out there, weaving through the trees of Black Ridge, coming and going as it pleases. I've tried to convince myself there's a logical explanation, but every time I picture that silhouette, I can't shake the feeling it was something beyond ordinary. And that's what keeps me up some nights, wondering if, someday, it might show up again, silently watching from the shadows, just out of sight. Story 19. My name is Walton Havisham, and in 2022, I was sent to Dunsborough, North Carolina, to check out some unusual nighttime activity. I'm used to searching for lost hikers or spotting signs of animals in restricted areas, but Dunsborough felt different right from the start. The place seemed quiet and welcoming enough, with its small houses and friendly locals, but underneath that calm, there was this lingering sense that something was off. Everyone kept whispering about sounds in the woods at night, and this feeling of being watched whenever they wandered out after dark. The day I'll never forget started out looking ordinary. I woke up early, geared up, and went to survey one of the higher trails just outside town. At first, everything felt normal. The chilly morning air brushing against my face, the comforting crunch of gravel under my boots, and the smell of the pine trees around me. Still, I couldn't shake off this strange tension in my chest, like I was bracing for something even though I had no idea what it might be. Around mid-morning, I decided to head down toward a valley where families used to camp before these strange reports began. I walked through the usual spots, checking for any fresh footprints or signs of disturbances. The tents that people had left behind were still in good shape. No clear sign of animals tearing them up or anything. Yet there was something about the air that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It felt heavier than normal, like I was surrounded by a secret I couldn't crack. I found a few small footprints by the riverbank, but they looked more like old tracks, maybe from some teenager who had been out here messing around. Nothing alarming. I took a few pictures anyway and moved on. At some point, I caught a faint noise, like branches snapping far off, almost too quiet to hear. The forest itself seemed too still, as if everything was holding its breath. By early afternoon, I reached a stretch of trees where, a few days before, I'd noticed some broken branches forming an odd pattern. I wanted to see if anything had changed. Sure enough, more branches were cracked at strange angles, almost like someone had wedged them that way on purpose. It reminded me of warning signs animals sometimes leave, except these breaks were higher up, like maybe 7 or 8 feet off the ground. I know that might not sound too wild, but the height was unusual, and the arrangement just felt wrong, like a deliberate pattern of some sort. Despite my unease, I kept pushing forward, doing my job, taking more photos, and documenting everything. The feeling I was being watched got stronger, even though I never caught a glimpse of anyone or anything following me. Sometimes I thought I heard twigs snapping behind me, but whenever I turned around, there was just quiet. I tried not to dwell on it. After all, wildlife can move in silent ways, and your mind can play tricks on you when you're alone in unfamiliar territory. As the afternoon rolled into evening, I was supposed to link up with another ranger for a night patrol. We had a plan to monitor some of the more remote trails because that's where people kept claiming they heard weird noises. I arrived at our meeting spot, a small clearing where we usually park our trucks. I stood there waiting for him, scanning the horizon, but he was running late. The sun was dipping below the trees, and a chilly breeze swept across the clearing, carrying with it that uneasy silence again. After about 10 minutes, my radio crackled. It was my partner, explaining he'd gotten tied up with a different assignment. He said he'd be another hour or so. Against my better judgment, I decided to start patrolling on my own. I headed along a narrow dirt path that wound through thick woodland. The light was fading fast, and the deeper I went, the darker and colder it felt. Even the birds seemed to have gone completely silent. I must have walked for about 20 minutes when I noticed a musky odor in the air, something like wet fur mixed with damp earth. I can usually identify common animal scents, but this was different. I felt my pulse quicken. As I paused to figure out the direction of the smell, I heard this low, heavy footstep off to my left, like something big was shifting its weight. I aimed my flashlight that way, but it only hit dense undergrowth. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was a black bear or a deer. But there was no movement, no sound of an animal scurrying away, which you'd expect if you startled it. Suddenly I heard another step behind me, almost as if something was circling. My heart hammered in my chest. I spun around, shining the light in every direction, but I only saw flickers of leaves and branches. The temperature felt like it dropped in seconds. My breath turned shaky, and for the first time in a long while, I felt genuine fear out there in the forest. I decided to keep walking, hoping to put some distance between me and whatever was out there. But with every few steps I took, I heard another faint crunch of leaves that matched my own pace, just offset by a second or two. It was following me, carefully, almost taunting me. I tried calling out, "Hello, is anyone there?" I know, probably not the smartest move, but I wanted to see if some lost hiker or local prankster might reveal themselves. Instead, the forest swallowed my voice, and the silence that followed was worse than any reply I could have gotten. As I pushed forward, the smell got stronger, almost nauseating. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something unnaturally tall, slipping behind a thick tree trunk. I froze. It was too quick for me to see any details, just a towering outline that made my stomach drop. I pointed my flashlight in that direction, calling out again, but there was nothing. No sound of running, no sign of movement. Just me, my flashlight beam, and the creeping dread that I wasn't alone. All I wanted then was to get back to my truck and contact the other ranger. I turned around to head back, feeling every muscle in my body tense. That's when I noticed an unsettling detail. The path behind me looked slightly different, like the vegetation had shifted. Some of the branches I'd brushed past were broken in ways I hadn't noticed before. It was as if someone, or something, had followed me, leaving subtle signs of its presence. With my heart pounding, I started speed walking. Each time I thought I heard something behind me, I whipped around with my flashlight. I swear, I heard breathing. It was low and ragged, coming from somewhere close, but my beam never caught a single shape. It was almost like the forest itself was breathing, morphing into this living, watching entity. My mind raced to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the wind, or an echo of my own breath, but it felt far too real. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the clearing where my truck was parked. I scrambled inside, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands were shaking so hard, I had trouble fitting the key into the ignition. I turned on the headlights, half expecting to see something lurking just beyond the tree line. But there was nothing, just the empty clearing and the silent woods. For a second, I wondered if I'd imagined it all. Yet the smell was still there, faintly clinging to my clothes, proving something tangible had been out there with me. I radioed my partner to tell him what happened, but all he heard was my shaky voice saying I wasn't feeling well and was heading back to our station. I couldn't even bring myself to describe what I saw, or what I thought I saw. When I got back, I checked myself over for any cuts or scratches, anything to prove that confrontation had been physical. Nothing, just the dread that clung to me like a shadow. The strangest part is that after that night, things in Dunsborough seemed to go quiet again. The next morning, the townspeople didn't mention hearing or seeing anything unusual. Some folks asked if I'd found any new evidence, but I didn't know how to answer them. I told them about odd footprints and maybe some large animal I couldn't identify, but I left out the details about the figure I'd glimpsed and how it seemed to toy with me in the dark. I guess I didn't want to stir up panic or have them think I was losing it. To this day, I can't explain what was out there. Maybe it was a bear with a strange gait, or some rare creature I've never encountered before. But a part of me believes there's something in those woods that doesn't want to be found, and is perfectly capable of scaring people away when it feels threatened. Every time I close my eyes, I remember that shifting shadow and that suffocating odor. and it sends a chill down my spine all over again. I haven't talked much about this since I left Dunsborough. Life went on, and no official record ever confirmed anything bizarre. But I still think about that day. It started so normal and ended with me gripped by a fear I'd never felt on the job before. Whatever happened there stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving me with more questions than answers. Even now, I have no idea what was watching me in that forest, and I'm not sure I ever want to find out. Story 20. I remember that day like a punch in the gut. Everything started out so normal, but by nightfall, I was questioning every noise, every movement, every single step I took. It was early morning when I headed out with Dorsey Forrester. We planned to check some of the sensors we had set up around Pinevale Lake, hoping to confirm or debunk the weird reports we'd been collecting. We'd been stationed there for a short project, just enough time to see if these rumors about a tall, hairy figure lurking in the woods had any merit. I honestly thought it was just local lore, maybe people seeing a bear or something. But I also felt a weird excitement about possibly being part of something bigger. We started at sunrise to avoid the afternoon heat. Dorsey and I followed a trail that looped around the lake, cutting through thick clusters of pines and low brush. The place was still quiet, barely any visitors around. I could hear our boots pressing into the damp soil, twigs snapping underfoot. Birds were just starting to wake up, and the morning light gave everything that golden glow that almost makes you forget you're out there looking for something potentially dangerous. By noon, we had inspected 3 sensors with no remarkable findings, just the usual logs of animals crossing by at night, maybe a stray deer or 2. Even so, something felt off. I can't really explain it. It was just this underlying tension, like someone was holding their breath in the dark, watching. But there was no concrete reason for me to feel spooked. I tried to brush it off as nerves. Maybe I was just letting local stories get into my head. Around mid-afternoon, we decided to split up to cover ground faster. Dorsey went east, and I continued on a narrower path that wrapped around the lake's far side. This area felt more remote, with denser trees and fewer signs of visitors. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth, and the only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional bird call. The further I went, the more I noticed how still the forest had become. Even the breeze seemed to disappear. Not long after, one of our motion detectors pinged on my handheld device. The alert indicated some movement a few hundred yards north, near a rocky clearing by the water. I figured it could be a fisherman or maybe just a large animal, but the reading looked odd. It kept popping in and out, like something was moving, stopping, then moving again, erratically. I radioed Dorsey but got only static, which wasn't too unusual in those remote spots. I decided to head toward the source of the signal. As I approached, the terrain got steeper and the brush thickened. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. There's this moment when you realize you're not alone, even if you can't see anything. I slowed down, trying to keep as quiet as possible. My heart started thumping harder in my chest. You tell yourself it's just nerves, but deep down, you know something is off. Suddenly, I heard it. A quick shuffle of steps. Could have been branches snapping under heavy feet. My mind instantly pictured the big, furry shape people had been talking about. I held my breath and inched forward, scanning every shadow between the pine trunks. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of movement, something tall bolting behind a thick cluster of trees. I barely caught a glimpse, but whatever it was, it had this hunched posture and a huge outline, definitely bigger than any person I knew. It moved so fast, it almost looked unnatural. My adrenaline kicked in. I immediately flicked on my flashlight, even though it was still daytime, just to see if I could catch a better look. I sprinted in that direction, ducking under low branches and hopping over logs. My mind was racing. What the hell was that? Am I going to find it? Do I even want to? My pulse hammered in my ears so loud I couldn't hear much else. Every time I thought I was getting close, I'd see another quick movement deeper into the forest, like it was leading me further away. I started getting disoriented, no longer sure of my exact location. The trees felt claustrophobic, with branches snagging my clothes. A couple times I thought I heard this deep panting or grunt, but it was so faint I couldn't be sure if it was just my own breathing echoing off the trees. After what felt like forever, though it was probably just a few minutes, I realized I'd lost whatever I was chasing. I skidded to a stop, completely out of breath, and the silence rushed back in. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. No birds, no wind, just eerie quiet. I tried to orient myself, looking for any landmarks or trail markers, but everything looked the same, tall pines and packed dirt. I stood there, scanning the area, when I noticed some faint impressions in the damp soil. They were spaced far apart, almost like footprints but distorted. Each impression looked wide, more like an outline than a clear track, but they were consistent enough to suggest something on two legs. I knelt down to inspect them, feeling that weird tingle of both curiosity and dread. They didn't look like bear tracks. They seemed more elongated, but not quite human either. I snapped a few photos, though my hands were shaking so badly I'm not sure how clear they turned out. That's when I felt the presence again. You know how you can sometimes sense somebody behind you before you see them? This wave of cold shot through me. I looked up and caught a glimpse of it, barely. It was watching me from between two massive pines, partially hidden by branches. I could only see part of a head and shoulder, definitely covered in something that looked like fur or thick hair. Its eyes seemed dark and reflective, like they absorbed the light instead of reflecting it back. I was so stunned I just froze. Time felt like it stretched, but it couldn't have been more than a second or two. Then it moved, this quick, silent step behind the trunk, and it was gone again. My body finally snapped out of the trance, and I swear my heart nearly burst from my chest. I stood up so fast that I stumbled backward, trying to keep my eyes on that spot. But there was nothing there except the faint motion of leaves. No sounds, no more footsteps. Just emptiness. My hands were trembling as I tried the radio again, but all I got was static. I realized it was getting late, the sun already dipping behind the trees. The forest was turning that grayish color that signals nightfall is close. I wasn't about to chase this thing in the dark, alone. I forced myself to calm down, breathe deep, and figure out how to get back to the main trail. It took me a while, and the shadows grew longer with each step. My flashlight became my main source of comfort, even though it kept revealing shapes that made my heart skip. Every fallen branch looked like an arm, every cluster of leaves seemed like a crouching figure. I kept expecting to see it lurking again, just out of reach. But I never did. By the time I made it back to a familiar path, I saw Dorsey's flashlight beaming through the trees in the distance. We were both relieved to see each other. He looked almost as rattled as I felt, though he didn't mention any sightings, just that he'd lost contact with me and got worried. We decided to head straight back to our base camp, neither of us saying much along the way. I don't think we wanted to spook each other any more than we already were. When we finally made it back, we checked the sensors again. Sure enough, one of them had recorded erratic heat signatures around the exact time I saw that thing. The data points jumped around like something was running circles through the forest, too high off the ground for most animals. It didn't give us a clear image, just more confusion. That was the same night everything suddenly stopped. No more odd sensor readings, no more glimpses in the trees. It was like the forest swallowed whatever it was and decided we'd had enough. We stayed up late, combing through evidence, but we never found anything conclusive. Even the footprints I photographed looked vague in the pictures, like random smudges. I still can't explain what I saw, and to this day, whenever I think about Pinevale, I feel that same jolt of fear crawl down my spine. I keep replaying those few seconds I locked eyes with whatever lurked there, and I wonder what it was thinking. Was it curious about me, territorial, threatened? I have no clue. All I know is that after that single day, the forest went silent again, and I was left with more questions than answers. I left Pinevale with a knot in my stomach, knowing I might never truly understand what happened. But I'm absolutely sure of one thing. There's something out there that defies easy explanation. I felt it watching me. I still do sometimes, in my nightmares. And I guess that's all I can really say about it.